On the night most women dream about forever, Queen Evelyn Ashcombe learned the difference between a crown and a cage. While silk sheets grew cold in the royal chamber, her husband, the king she'd married 6 hours earlier, was 3 corridors away, buried between another woman's thighs. But here's the thing about betrayal that cuts deep enough to scar. It doesn't always break you. Sometimes it rebuilds you into something the world isn't ready for. This is the story of a queen who turned abandonment into an empire. And if you want to see how a forgotten bride becomes the most dangerous woman in the kingdom, you better stick around until the end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. Let me know where my people are watching from, because this tale is about to get wild. The ceremonial bells had stopped ringing 3 hours ago. Evelyn sat alone in the bridal chamber, watching 27 candles burn themselves into puddles of wax. She'd counted them twice. Counting kept her hands from shaking. Counting kept her mind from screaming. The room smelled like roses and lies. Outside the carved oak doors, she could hear the distant laughter of nobles still drunk on wedding wine, their voices echoing through stone corridors like ghosts of a celebration that had never included her. The Kingdom of Valmont had married its young king to a foreign princess, secured a strategic alliance with the Ashcombe territories, and thrown a festival that would be remembered for generations. And nobody had bothered to tell the bride that she didn't matter. Evelyn stood slowly, her wedding gown weighing heavy as armor. The seamstresses had spent 6 weeks on this dress, every pearl sewn by hand, every thread dipped in silver. She looked like something out of a fairy tale. She felt like a fool. Her reflection stared back from the full-length mirror, and for a moment she didn't recognize herself. 22 years old, dark hair twisted into elaborate braids that had taken 4 handmaids to arrange, blue eyes that her mother always said were her greatest weapon. Right now those eyes looked hollow. The door creaked open. Evelyn spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs like a prisoner trying to escape. For one stupid, desperate second, she thought maybe Cedric had come back. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe... Lady Margot slipped inside and closed the door behind her with a soft click that sounded like a coffin lid. The older woman was one of Cedric's distant cousins, a fixture of the court with silver-streaked hair and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She'd been kind to Evelyn during the wedding preparations. Patient, understanding. Now Evelyn understood why. Pity looks a lot like kindness until you know the difference. "Lady Margot," Evelyn said, and hated how small her voice sounded. "Have you seen the king?" The pause lasted 1 heartbeat too long. "Your Majesty," Lady Margot began, and the formal title felt like a slap. His Majesty was called away on urgent business. Affairs of state, you understand. Evelyn felt something cold slide down her spine. She understood all right. What kind of affairs? Lady Margot's expression flickered, the kind that require discretion. The cold thing in Evelyn's spine spread to her chest, her stomach, her fingertips. She walked past Lady Margot to the door and pulled it open. 2 royal guards stood in the corridor, their faces carefully blank. "Where is King Cedric?" Evelyn asked them directly. The guards looked at each other. The younger one's jaw tightened. "The Eastern Wing, Your Majesty," he said quietly. "The Rose Apartment." Evelyn had studied the palace maps during her engagement. The Rose Apartment was a private suite overlooking the gardens, far from the main royal quarters, far from anywhere a king might legitimately conduct late-night business, far from his wife. "Your Majesty," Lady Margot said from behind her, her voice gentle as a knife. "Perhaps it would be wise to retire for the evening. The king will surely explain when—" "Who is she?" Silence dropped like a stone into water. Evelyn turned to face Lady Margot, and something in her expression made the older woman take a step back. The guard who'd spoken shifted his weight. The other one stared at the ceiling. "I asked you a question," Evelyn said, and her voice didn't sound small anymore. "Who is the woman my husband is with instead of me on our wedding night?" Lady Margot's face went pale. "Your Majesty, this is not appropriate." "Her name," Evelyn said. "Now." The word came out like a command, and Evelyn felt something shift inside her chest. She'd spent her entire life being appropriate, being polite, being the perfect princess her parents had raised her to be. Look where appropriate had gotten her. "Lady Celine Ashford," the younger guard said suddenly. He met Evelyn's eyes with something that might have been respect. She's been the king's companion for 2 years. 2 years. Eveline felt the words like a physical blow. Cedric had courted her for 6 months. 6 months of letters and visits and carefully chaperoned walks through gardens. 6 months of him looking at her like she mattered, like their marriage would be more than politics. 2 years. He'd been with Celine before he ever wrote Eveline's first letter. "Thank you," Eveline said to the guard. She looked at Lady Margot. "You can go." "Your Majesty, I really think—" "I said go." Lady Margot hesitated, then curtsied and fled. The guards remained, silent witnesses to a humiliation that would be gossip by morning. Eveline closed the door and leaned against it, her breath coming in short gasps that threatened to turn into sobs. She pressed both hands flat against the wood and felt the grain dig into her palms. "Don't cry," she told herself. "Don't you dare cry." But her eyes burned anyway. She'd been so stupid, so desperately, pathetically stupid. She'd actually believed the letters. Believed Cedric when he'd called her beautiful, when he'd talked about building a future together, when he'd slipped that ring onto her finger and promised to honor her above all others. Above all others. The laugh that escaped her throat sounded broken. Eveline pushed away from the door and paced the length of the bridal chamber, her wedding gown rustling like dead leaves. The bed dominated the room, massive and canopied, covered in silk sheets that cost more than some families earned in a year. Rose petals scattered across the pillows. Someone had prepared this room for a wedding night. Someone had lit the candles and arranged the flowers and turned down the sheets. Someone had known she would spend it alone. The thought hit her like cold water. This wasn't a surprise. This wasn't some unexpected crisis that had pulled Cedric away. This was planned. The entire court knew. Eveline stopped pacing and stood very still in the center of the room. Her mind started working again, cutting through the hurt like a blade through fog. Lady Margot had come to check on her, not to comfort her, to make sure she stayed put, to keep her from making a scene. The guards had answered her questions, but they'd looked uncomfortable, ashamed. They hadn't known whether to respect her as queen or pity her as the woman Cedric had humiliated. And Cedric himself. Cedric was 3 corridors away, proving to his mistress that a wife changed nothing. The candles were halfway gone now. Eveline watched the flames dance and gutter and felt something inside her go very quiet and very cold. She walked to her traveling trunk and opened it. Her hands moved with steady precision as she stripped off the wedding gown, letting thousands of silver threads and hand-sewn pearls pool on the floor like discarded dreams. She dressed in a simple dark gown, something forgettable. Then she left the bridal chamber. The corridors of Valmont Palace twisted like a maze designed to confuse invaders. Eveline had memorized the layouts during her engagement, the same way she'd memorized the names and positions of every major noble, every key minister, every potential ally. Her parents hadn't raised a fool. They'd raised a weapon. They'd just wrapped her in silk and called her a bride. She moved through this palace like a shadow, avoiding the main halls where drunk nobles still celebrated. Servants passed her without a second glance, just another lady of the court retiring for the night. The eastern wing was older than the rest of the palace, built during the reign of Cedric's grandfather. The stone here felt colder. The tapestries depicted conquest instead of prosperity. Eveline found the Rose apartment at the end of a quiet corridor. Light glowed beneath the door. She could hear voices inside, low and intimate. She stood there for a long moment, her hand hovering near the door handle. This was the moment. She could walk away, pretend she didn't know, play the dutiful queen who smiled through humiliation and bore it with grace. Or she could open the door and see exactly what her marriage was worth. Eveline pushed the door open. The scene inside burned itself into her memory with the clarity of a blade, a sitting room decorated in shades of cream and gold, a fireplace casting dancing shadows across expensive furniture. A woman with honey-colored hair and a gown that cost more than Eveline's dowry, draped across a velvet couch like she owned the world. And Cedric. King Cedric Valmont stood by the window with his back to the door, his wedding coat discarded over a chair, his posture relaxed in a way he'd never been around Eveline. He turned at the sound of the door opening, and for one perfect moment, Eveline watched shock break across his face like glass. "Eveline," he said, and she heard genuine surprise in his voice. "What are you doing here?" The woman on the couch, Celine, didn't move. She just watched with dark eyes that glittered like a cat's in firelight. Eveline looked at her husband. really looked at him. He was handsome in the way powerful men often are, all strong jaw and confident bearing. 28 years old and already starting to soften around the edges from too much wine and too little consequence. She'd thought she could love him. She'd been wrong about a lot of things. "I'm looking for my husband," Eveline said quietly, "but I see he's occupied." Cedric had the grace to look uncomfortable. This isn't what it looks like. Eveline felt that cold, quiet thing inside her chest expand. "Really? Because it looks like you abandoned your wedding bed to spend the night with your mistress." Celine laughed. The sound was like breaking glass. "Your Majesty," she said, and the title dripped with mockery. "How dramatic. Cedric and I were simply discussing matters of court." "At midnight," Eveline said. "In your nightclothes." Celine's gown was thin silk, completely inappropriate for anything except seduction. Cedric's shirt was unlaced. "Eveline," Cedric said, and now he sounded annoyed instead of guilty. "You're being unreasonable. I have responsibilities that extend beyond our personal arrangement." "Our personal arrangement," Eveline repeated slowly. "Is that what you call our marriage? Don't twist my words, then choose better ones." Cedric's face flushed. "You will not speak to me like that. I am your king." Something snapped inside Eveline's chest. Not violently, almost gently, like a rope that had been pulled too tight for too long finally giving way. "You're right," she said. "You are the king, and I am your queen, your wife. The woman you made vows to 6 hours ago in front of the entire kingdom." She stepped further into the room, and both Cedric and Celine shifted slightly, as if her presence had disrupted some invisible balance. "I stood in that throne room and promised to honor you," Eveline continued, "to support your reign, to give you heirs and counsel and loyalty. And you promised me the same. Did you mean any of it, or was I just another treaty you signed?" Cedric's jaw tightened. "This marriage is a political alliance. You knew that." "I knew that," Eveline agreed. "I also thought you were a man of honor." Celine laughed again. "Honor. How adorable." "Tell me, Your Majesty, did your parents explain how the world actually works before they sent you here like a sacrificial lamb?" Eveline looked at the other woman, really looked at her. Celine was beautiful in a calculated way. Every curl arranged, every gesture practiced. She wore her position as the king's mistress like armor. But there was something desperate in her eyes. Eveline filed that information away. "Enough," Cedric said. "Eveline, you talks pamiti. Eveline, you will return to your chambers and we will discuss this in the morning when you've calmed down." "I'm perfectly calm," Eveline said, and it was true. The hurt had transformed into something clearer, sharper. "I just want to understand the rules." "What rules?" "The rules of this arrangement." She gestured between Cedric and Celine. "Am I expected to pretend this doesn't exist? To smile and look the other way while you humiliate me in front of the entire court? Or are we being honest now?" Cedric looked at her like she'd started speaking a foreign language. "You're my wife. You'll behave like a queen and stop making a scene." Eveline felt that cold thing inside her settle into something permanent, something that would never thaw. "I see," she said quietly. "Thank you for clarifying." She turned toward the door. "Eveline," Cedric called after her, and now he sounded uncertain. "Where are you going?" She looked back over her shoulder. "To bed. Alone. Like I apparently should have expected." "Wait." But Eveline was already gone, moving back through the corridors with steady steps. She didn't run. She didn't cry. She walked like a queen. Back in the bridal chamber, the candles had burned down to stubs. Eveline closed the door and stood in the near darkness, her hands perfectly steady. Then she walked to the writing desk and lit a fresh candle. She pulled out parchment and ink, and she began to write. The first letter was to her parents, short, factual. The marriage had been consummated in name only. She was politically secured but personally alone. She would fulfill her duties as queen, but she wanted them to know the truth. The second letter was to her younger brother, the only person in her family she actually trusted. She told him everything: the abandonment, the mistress, the humiliation. The third letter was to herself, a list. Every person she'd seen at the wedding who'd looked at her with pity instead of surprise. Every noble who'd known about Celine and said nothing. Every servant who'd helped Cedric maintain his double life. She filled 3 pages with names. When she finished, Eveline sat back and looked at her work. The list was longer than she'd expected. The betrayal ran deeper. Good, she thought. That means I know exactly who I'm dealing with. She folded the self-addressed letter and tucked it into a hidden pocket she'd sewn into all her gowns. Her mother had taught her that. Always have a place to hide the things that matter. Then she sealed her parents' letters and set them aside for morning. Finally, she undressed and climbed into the massive wedding bed. The silk sheets felt cold against her skin. The rose petals had started to wilt. Eveline lay in the darkness and stared at the canopy above her head. This was supposed to be the beginning of her life. Instead, it felt like the end of something. The end of the girl who'd believed in honor and vows and fairy tale promises. But maybe that wasn't a bad thing. Maybe that girl had been too soft to survive in a world like this. Eveline closed her eyes and made a decision. Not emotionally, analytically. The same way she'd learned to play chess, looking several moves ahead, calculating risks and advantages. If Cedric wanted Celine, he could have her. If he wanted to rule through pleasure instead of wisdom, that was his choice. But Eveline would not spend the rest of her life as a decorative wife, smiling through humiliation while the kingdom whispered behind her back. If Cedric controlled the crown, she would control everything else. She would learn this court inside and out. She would build alliances with the people Cedric ignored. She would become indispensable to the ministers, invaluable to the military commanders, irreplaceable to the merchants and craftsmen who kept the kingdom running. She would take all the intelligence and training her parents had given her, all the languages and economics and strategy they'd poured into her education, and she would use it, not for Cedric's benefit, for her own. The thought settled into her bones like steel. Eveline opened her eyes in the darkness and whispered to the empty room, "You want a queen who stays silent and looks pretty. I'll give you a queen who reshapes your entire kingdom while you're too busy screwing your mistress to notice." Then she smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a woman who'd just declared war on a king who didn't even realize the battle had started. Morning came with pale light filtering through heavy curtains. Eveline woke early, her mind already moving through the day ahead. A handmaid knocked softly and entered with breakfast. Bread, cheese, fruit, watered wine. The girl looked nervous. "Your Majesty," she said quietly, keeping her eyes down. "Lord Chancellor Brennan requests an audience at your earliest convenience." Eveline sipped her wine. "For what purpose?" "He didn't say, Your Majesty, but he seemed concerned." Concerned meant the whole palace already knew about last night. "Good. Let them know. Let them see that their new queen wasn't going to pretend everything was fine." "Tell the Lord Chancellor I'll receive him in an hour," Eveline said. "In the Queen's solar, not here." The handmaid curtsied and left. Eveline dressed carefully in a gown of deep blue velvet, severe and elegant. She arranged her hair in a simple style that framed her face. No elaborate braids today, no pearls. She looked like a woman who had work to do. The Queen's solar was a smaller chamber reserved for the Queen's private business, overlooking the palace gardens. Eveline had it opened and aired, the windows thrown wide to let in morning light. Lord Chancellor Brennan arrived exactly on time. He was 60 years old, gray-bearded and sharp-eyed, a career politician who'd served Cedric's father before him. He bowed low. "Your Majesty, thank you for seeing me." Eveline gestured to a chair. "Please, sit. You said you were concerned." Brennan settled into his seat with the careful movements of a man choosing his words. "Your Majesty, there are rumors circulating through the court. About last night." "I imagine there are," Eveline said calmly. "Rumors tend to circulate when a king abandons his wedding bed for his mistress." Brennan's eyebrows rose slightly. "You're aware, then?" "I was there, Lord Chancellor. I'm very aware." A pause. Then Brennan leaned forward slightly. "Your Majesty, I want you to know that some of us were disturbed by His Majesty's choices. The lack of respect shown to you is troubling." Eveline studied the old man's face. "Troubling for me, or troubling for the stability of the realm?" "Both," Brennan said without hesitation. "A king who humiliates his queen on their wedding night sends a message to the entire kingdom. It suggests weakness, poor judgment, a lack of self-control." Eveline felt something click into place. Brennan wasn't here out of kindness. He was here because Cedric had embarrassed the crown itself, and politicians like Brennan understood what that meant. Opportunity. "What would you suggest I do, Lord Chancellor?" Eveline asked carefully. Brennan met her eyes. "I would suggest you prove to this kingdom that you are stronger than the king's bad decisions. Show them that the Queen of Valmont is not a woman to be dismissed or ignored." How? By becoming indispensable. His Majesty has always been more interested in pleasures than policy. The kingdom runs despite him, not because of him. If you were to, take an interest in certain matters of state— "You're asking me to do the king's job," Eveline said. "I'm asking you to do what queens have always done," Brennan corrected. "Hold the kingdom together when the king cannot or will not." Eveline sat back in her chair, her mind racing. This was the opening she'd hoped for, arriving faster than she'd expected. Brennan was offering her a partnership, access to real power in exchange for taking on the work Cedric neglected. But why would Brennan risk the king's anger? Unless Cedric's anger didn't matter, because Cedric wasn't paying attention. "What specifically would this involvement entail?" Eveline asked. Brennan smiled slightly. "There's a trade dispute with the Northern Territories that requires delicate negotiation. The harvest taxes need restructuring before the autumn collection. The military commanders want to discuss border reinforcements, but His Majesty keeps canceling meetings." He ticked off items like a man who'd been waiting for someone to ask. "And you believe I'm qualified to handle these matters," Eveline said. "I believe you were educated in economics, speak 4 languages, including the northern dialects, and studied military history with some of the finest scholars in your homeland." Brennan's expression was shrewd. "I did my research before His Majesty's marriage, Your Majesty. I know exactly what kind of mind you have." Eveline felt a chill of recognition. Brennan had known she was overqualified to be a decorative wife. He'd been planning this. "Why now?" she asked. "Why not approach me before the wedding? Because before the wedding, you might have believed His Majesty would value your counsel directly. Now you know better." Brennan's voice softened slightly. "And because a humiliated queen has nothing to lose and everything to gain. That makes you dangerous, Your Majesty, in the best possible way." Eveline stood and walked to the window. Below, the palace garden spread out in geometric perfection, every hedge trimmed, every path calculated. She could do this. She could take Brennan's offer and start building the foundation of real power, but she had to be smart about it. "I'll consider your proposal, Lord Chancellor," Eveline said. "On one condition. Name it. You'll teach me everything, not just the matters you need me to handle, but the full scope of how this kingdom actually functions. The money, the military, the trade routes, the noble alliances, everything Cedric ignores." Brennan stood as well. "That's a tall order, Your Majesty." Eveline turned to face him. "You said I was dangerous. Prove it. Make me the most informed person in this palace." "Why?" "Because knowledge is the only currency that can't be taken away." Eveline's voice was steady as stone. "The king can ignore me. The court can mock me. But if I know more than all of them combined, eventually they'll need me more than I need them." Brennan studied her face for a long moment. Then he smiled, and it reached his eyes. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, "I believe you're going to be the most formidable queen this kingdom has ever seen." "Good," Eveline said. "Let's start tomorrow. Dawn, I want to understand the treasury accounts before the week is out." "As you wish." Brennan bowed and moved toward the door. Then he paused. "Your Majesty, one more thing. Yes, there will be people who resent your involvement, who see you as overstepping. They'll push back." "Let them," Eveline said. "I've already survived the worst thing this court can do to me. Everything after last night is just practice." Brennan's smile widened. "Then I suspect they're in for quite a surprise." After he left, Eveline stood alone in the solar and felt the first real stirring of something that wasn't pain or anger. It was hunger. Not for revenge, that was too small, too temporary. For power. Real power. The kind that would make her untouchable. She was done being the abandoned bride. It was time to become the queen this kingdom didn't know it needed, and Cedric wouldn't realize what was happening until it was far too late to stop her. The days that followed established a pattern that would define Eveline's transformation. She rose before dawn and met with Brennan, absorbing information like a desert drinking rain. The kingdom's finances were a mess. Bloated spending in the wrong places, neglected infrastructure, and suspicious payments to noble families who seemed to do nothing except complain. She asked questions that made Brennan blink in surprise. Hard questions. Questions that exposed weaknesses and inefficiencies. By the end of the first week, she'd identified 3 tax loopholes that were costing the Treasury a fortune. "Why hasn't this been addressed?" she asked Brennan. The Lord Chancellor sighed. "Because His Majesty finds financial discussions tedious, and the nobles benefiting from the loopholes are friends of Lady Celine." There it was again. Celine's influence spreading like poison through the court. Eveline made a note. She was building a second list now, not of enemies, but of leverage points. Places where the kingdom's dysfunction could be fixed, if someone had the will and the power to do it. She attended every court function with perfect composure, smiling pleasantly while nobles whispered behind their hands. She could feel their eyes on her, waiting for her to break, to show weakness, to confirm that she was exactly what they thought, a foreign bride who couldn't hold her husband's attention. Let them think it. Underestimation was a weapon too. Cedric barely spoke to her. He appeared at formal dinners and state events, played the role of attentive king, then disappeared to Celine's apartments. The court grew used to the pattern. Some nobles found it scandalous. Most found it boring. Eveline found it useful. While Cedric was distracted, she was learning the names of every military commander, every merchant guild leader, every minor noble with actual influence. She wrote letters in 4 languages to foreign courts, introducing herself, establishing connections. She made herself impossible to ignore by becoming impossible to avoid. 2 weeks after her wedding, she attended her first military strategy meeting. The commanders looked startled when she walked into the war room, Brennan at her side. "Gentlemen," Brennan said smoothly, "Her Majesty has expressed interest in understanding our defensive capabilities. I assured her you would be happy to provide a briefing." The senior commander, a grizzled veteran named General Marcus Thorne, looked like he'd swallowed something sour. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "this is highly irregular." "So as a king who cancels 3 consecutive meetings with his military leaders," Eveline said pleasantly, "I thought someone should understand what you need." Silence dropped like a stone. Then General Thorne smiled. It was a hard smile, but genuine. "Well then, Your Majesty, let me show you what we're working with." The next 2 hours were a revelation. The northern borders were undermanned. The southern garrisons were equipped with outdated weapons. The coastal defenses were a joke. And nobody had told Cedric because Cedric didn't want to hear about problems that required him to actually make decisions. Eveline asked questions. She studied maps. She listened while generals explained supply chains and defensive positions, and the difference between a sustainable military budget and the disaster they currently had. And she saw the exact moment when General Thorne stopped seeing her as the king's embarrassed wife and started seeing her as someone who might actually give a damn about keeping the kingdom safe. "Your Majesty," he said as the meeting concluded, "if I may speak plainly, please. This kingdom needs someone who takes its defense seriously." His tone made it clear who he thought that someone was not. Eveline met his eyes. "Then I suppose we should work together, General. I'll review your budget proposals and see what can be done." "The king doesn't attend these meetings," Eveline finished. "I do. That should tell you everything you need to know about who to bring your concerns to." General Thorne studied her for a long moment. Then he bowed, deeply and sincerely. "It will be my honor, Your Majesty." As Eveline left the war room, she caught Brennan's expression. "What?" she asked. "Nothing, Your Majesty." He smiled. "You're a fast learner. I had good teachers. That wasn't teaching. That was you understanding power when you saw it." Brennan's voice dropped. "General Thorne commands the loyalty of every soldier in this kingdom. You just made him your ally." "Not my ally," Eveline corrected. "The kingdom's ally." "There's a difference." "Is there?" "There has to be." She stopped walking and turned to face Brennan fully. "I'm not doing this for personal glory, Lord Chancellor. I'm doing this because someone needs to, and clearly Cedric won't." Brennan's expression grew serious. "Your Majesty, I need you to understand something. What you're building here, this web of alliances and influence, it's going to threaten people. Powerful people. Good, Evelyn said. Let them feel threatened. Maybe they'll start doing their jobs. That evening, Evelyn returned to her chambers exhausted, but exhilarated. Her handmaid helped her change into simpler clothes, and Evelyn collapsed into a chair with a stack of documents Brennan had given her. She was halfway through a report on grain distribution when her door opened without warning. Cedric stood in the doorway, still dressed for the evening's festivities, wine-flushed and irritated. Evelyn looked up slowly. Your Majesty, to what do I owe this unexpected visit? I hear you've been attending military meetings, Cedric said without preamble. I have. Why? Because they're important. Evelyn set down her documents. Someone should understand what our commanders need. That someone is me, Cedric said, his voice rising slightly. I'm the king. Then perhaps you should attend the meetings instead of canceling them. Evelyn kept her tone neutral, but she saw the barb land. Cedric's face flushed darker. You overstep. A queen does not involve herself in military matters. This queen does. Evelyn stood, facing him directly. Because this queen actually cares whether our borders are defended and our soldiers are equipped. Watch your tone. Or what? Evelyn felt that cold thing in her chest solidify into ice. You'll humiliate me. You already did that on our wedding night. You'll ignore me. You do that every day. What exactly are you threatening me with, Cedric? He stared at her like she'd grown a second head. When did you become so awake? Evelyn finished. The night you abandoned me for your mistress. That's when I realized this marriage is exactly what you said it was. A political arrangement. So I'm treating it like one. By undermining my authority. By supporting it. Evelyn's voice hardened. Every meeting I attend, every alliance I build, every problem I solve, it all makes you look better, not worse. I'm doing the work you won't do, and the kingdom is noticing. Cedric's jaw tightened. Celine said you were plotting something. Evelyn felt a spike of cold satisfaction. So Celine was paying attention. Good. I'm not plotting anything, Evelyn said. I'm governing. There's a difference. You're making me look weak. You did that yourself. I'm just cleaning up the mess. The words hung in the air between them like a declaration of war. Cedric took a step forward, and for a moment Evelyn thought he might actually strike her, but he just stood there breathing hard, his hands clenched into fists. You will stop this, he said quietly. You will return to your proper place as queen consort and stop interfering in matters that don't concern you. No, Evelyn said. What? I said no. She held his gaze. You want a decorative wife who smiles and stays silent. That's not who I am, and you should have figured that out before you married me. I'm educated. I'm intelligent. I speak 4 languages, and I understand economics and military strategy better than most of your advisors. And I'm not going to waste all of that sitting in a solar doing needlepoint while this kingdom falls apart. Cedric's expression shifted through shock, anger, and something that might have been fear. If you continue down this path, there will be consequences, he said. Then let there be consequences. Evelyn's voice stayed perfectly steady. Because I'm not stopping. They stared at each other across the space of her chambers. 2 people who'd promised to spend their lives together and had instead become enemies before the marriage was a month old. Finally, Cedric turned and walked out without another word. Evelyn stood alone in the silence, her heart hammering, her hands shaking with adrenaline. Then she sat back down and picked up her documents. The grain distribution report wasn't going to read itself. Then, the confrontation with Cedric changed something fundamental in the palace dynamics. Word spread, because word always spread, that the queen had openly defied the king. Some courtiers expected Cedric to retaliate. Others waited for Evelyn to back down. Neither happened. Instead, Cedric withdrew further into Celine's world, surrounding himself with sycophants who told him what he wanted to hear and ignored anything that resembled actual work. And Evelyn expanded her influence like water finding cracks in stone. She met with merchant guild leaders and learned about the trade routes that kept the capital fed. She discovered the tariffs were strangling commerce and quietly suggested adjustments that could increase revenue without hurting the people. The merchants started calling her the practical queen. She attended sessions with the royal physicians and learned about the healthcare system, or the lack of one. Rural areas had almost no access to medicine. Disease spread unchecked through the poorest districts. She proposed a network of regional healing houses, funded through a tax on luxury goods. The physicians called her the compassionate queen. She studied the legal code and found it riddled with archaic laws that punished poverty while protecting privilege. She couldn't change the laws directly. That required the king's seal. But she could make sure everyone knew which laws needed changing. The common people started calling her the just queen, and through it all, she kept her lists. The nobles who supported Cedric's negligence, the ministers who enabled Celine's corruption, the courtiers who'd known about the betrayal and said nothing. She memorized every name, every connection, every weakness. Because Evelyn was playing a long game now, and she was patient. 1 month after her wedding, she received her first real test. A grain shortage hit the northern provinces. Crop failures combined with mismanaged reserves meant thousands faced starvation before winter. The crisis landed on Cedric's desk. He read the first page of the report, declared it tedious, and handed it to Celine. Celine suggested raising taxes on the affected provinces to make up for lost revenue. Evelyn found out about it from Brennan, who looked genuinely frightened. If they implement this, Your Majesty, people will starve. And when people starve, they revolt. Then we don't let them implement it, Evelyn said calmly. How? The king has already approved Celine's proposal. Has he signed the decree? Brennan blinked. Not yet. But then there's time. Evelyn stood. Call an emergency council meeting. Full attendance. Tell them the queen requests it. Your Majesty, the king won't appreciate... I don't care what this king appreciates, Evelyn said flatly. People are going to die if we don't fix this. Call the meeting. 2 hours later, Evelyn walked into the council chamber to find every major minister present, along with Cedric, who looked annoyed at being summoned. Celine sat beside him, her expression coldly amused. Lord Chancellor Brennan stood at the head of the table. Thank you all for coming on short notice. Her Majesty the Queen has urgent concerns regarding the northern grain situation. All eyes turned to Evelyn. She didn't sit. She stood at the opposite end of the table from Cedric and met each person's gaze in turn. Gentlemen, she began, I understand there's a proposal to increase taxes on the northern provinces to compensate for crop failures. Several ministers nodded. Cedric looked bored. Who suggested this? Silence. Then Celine spoke up, her voice silk over steel. I did, Your Majesty. It's a logical solution. If the provinces can't provide grain, they should pay for us to acquire it elsewhere. Evelyn kept her expression neutral. And where would we acquire grain elsewhere? The southern provinces have surplus. And how would we transport that grain north before winter? More silence. Evelyn pulled out a document she'd prepared. According to our infrastructure reports, the northern roads are impassable once the first snow hits. That's roughly 6 weeks from now. Even if we could purchase enough grain, and the southern provinces don't have enough surplus to feed an entire region, we couldn't deliver it in time. She looked directly at Celine. So your logical solution would involve taxing people who are already starving, failing to actually feed them, and creating the conditions for a revolt that would spread to every northern territory. Celine's face went cold. I wasn't aware the Queen was an expert in logistics. I'm not, Evelyn said, but I consulted with people who are. She nodded to General Thorne, who'd been sitting quietly in the corner. The general cleared his throat. Her Majesty asked me to assess the transportation situation, he said. She's correct. We can't move enough grain north in time. And if we raise taxes on starving people, we'll have a military problem, not just an economic one. Cedric straightened in his chair. Then what do you suggest? Evelyn answered before anyone else could. We opened the royal grain reserves. We've been stockpiling for years. This is exactly the kind of emergency those reserves exist for. That grain is meant for the capital, one of the ministers objected. If we give it away, we're not giving it away, Evelyn interrupted. We're investing it in stability. A stable northern region means continued trade, continued tax revenue in future years, and no revolt. An unstable north means war, disrupted commerce, and refugees flooding south. She pulled out a second document. I've prepared a distribution plan. We release 70% of the royal reserves to the north, maintain 30% for capital security. We expedite shipments before the roads close, and we waive this quarter's taxes for the affected provinces, then reinstate them next year when the crisis has passed. Several ministers exchanged glances. This is overly generous, Celine said sharply. It sets a dangerous precedent. Does it? Evelyn asked. Or does it show the kingdom that their rulers actually care whether they live or die? We can't afford— Yes, we can. Evelyn's voice cut through the room like a blade. I've reviewed the treasury accounts. We're spending a fortune on luxuries while infrastructure crumbles. If we cut palace expenditures by 20% and redirect those funds to emergency relief, we can afford both the grain distribution and the tax waiver. She let that sink in for a moment, watching faces around the table process what she'd just said. Cut palace expenditures meant cutting the lavish parties, the expensive gifts, the constant flow of luxuries that Cedric and Celine enjoyed. You're suggesting we sacrifice royal comfort for commoners, Celine said, and the contempt in her voice was naked. I'm suggesting we do our jobs, Evelyn replied. We rule this kingdom. That means taking care of it, not bleeding it dry. The king rules, Celine snapped. You're just his wife. Evelyn smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. Then perhaps the king should start ruling. Right now, I seem to be the only person in this room offering a solution that doesn't involve mass starvation or rebellion. She turned to Cedric, who'd been watching the exchange with an unreadable expression. Your Majesty, she said formally, you have a choice. Approve Lady Celine's proposal and watch the North burn, or approve mine and save thousands of lives while maintaining stability. The room went silent. Cedric looked at Celine, then at Evelyn, then at the ministers, who were all carefully not taking sides. Finally, he spoke. How certain are you about the timeline? His question was directed at General Thorne. Completely certain, sire. If we don't move grain within 6 weeks, people die. Period. Cedric's jaw tightened. He looked back at Evelyn. And you're confident the Treasury can handle this? I've done the mathematics 3 times, Evelyn said. Yes. Another long pause. Then Cedric nodded once sharply. Fine. Implement the Queen's plan. Evelyn felt victory surge through her veins, but kept her expression calm. Thank you, Your Majesty. But, Cedric continued, his voice hardening, the palace expenditure cuts will be managed by my household, not yours. I won't have you dictating how the royal family spends its resources. Of course, Evelyn said smoothly, as long as the 20% reduction is met. Cedric nodded curtly and stood. If we're finished. He left without waiting for an answer, Celine trailing after him like a silk shadow. The door closed, and Evelyn felt her knees go weak with released tension. Remarkable, Lord Chancellor Brennan said quietly. He was smiling. Absolutely remarkable. We're not finished yet, Evelyn said. We need to move immediately. General, can you organize transport? Already on it, Your Majesty. Good. She turned to the finance minister. I'll need a full accounting of expenditures by tomorrow morning to determine where we're cutting. Yes, Your Majesty. As the ministers filed out, several of them bowed to Evelyn with genuine respect instead of perfunctory courtesy. When the room cleared, Evelyn sank into a chair and let out a shaking breath. She'd just won her first real battle, and Cedric didn't even realize he'd lost it. The grain distribution saved the northern provinces, but it cost Evelyn something she hadn't anticipated: invisibility. Before the crisis, she'd been background noise, the abandoned wife doing busy work while the real court happened elsewhere. Now people were watching. Not just watching, calculating. Every minister who'd seen her dismantle Celine's proposal, every commander who'd witnessed her grasp military logistics, every merchant who'd felt the ripple effects of her economic adjustments. They were all asking the same question: who the hell is this woman, and what does she want? Evelyn knew the answer even if they didn't yet. She wanted everything they'd tried to deny her, and she was going to take it piece by piece until the kingdom forgot Cedric wore the crown. 3 days after the council meeting, she received her first death threat. It arrived on expensive parchment, the handwriting elegant as a knife. Stop interfering, or accidents happen to foreign queens who forget their place. No signature, no seal, just venom wrapped in calligraphy. Evelyn read it twice, then filed it with her growing collection of intelligence. The handwriting matched correspondence she'd seen from Lord Davin Hartwick, a nobleman whose family had been bleeding the northern trade routes dry for generations. Her grain distribution had cut into his profits. Good, she thought. If I'm not making enemies, I'm not doing enough. She showed the letter to General Thorne during their next meeting. The general's face went stone cold. Your Majesty, threats against the crown are treason, only if the crown chooses to prosecute them. Evelyn folded the letter carefully. Right now, I'd rather know who wants me dead than arrest one man and drive the rest underground. You're using yourself as bait. I'm gathering information. There's a difference. Thorne studied her with something that looked like grudging respect mixed with concern. You're playing a dangerous game, Your Majesty. Every game is dangerous when the stakes are this high. Evelyn met his eyes. Tell me something, General. If the kingdom had to choose between the king's authority and its own survival, which would it pick? The question hung in the air like smoke. Thorne didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was careful. The kingdom doesn't make choices. People do. Then, let me rephrase. If you had to choose, which would you pick? Survival. Thorne's answer came without hesitation. Always survival. Evelyn smiled. Then we understand each other. After Thorne left, Evelyn sat alone in her solar and felt the weight of what she was building. Not just influence, not just alliances. She was constructing an entire shadow government that ran parallel to Cedric's court, and the people running it were starting to look to her instead of him. It was intoxicating. It was terrifying. It was necessary, because Cedric wasn't just neglecting his duties anymore. He was actively making things worse. The palace expenditure cuts he'd promised never materialized. Instead, spending increased. Lavish gifts for Celine. New furnishings for her apartments. A festival celebrating nothing except Cedric's desire to prove he wasn't being controlled by his wife's practical suggestions. The treasury bled gold while Evelyn watched and documented everything. Lord Chancellor Brennan brought her the accounting records with hands that shook slightly. Your Majesty, he said quietly, if this continues, we'll be bankrupt within 2 years. Then we make sure it doesn't continue. How? The king won't listen to reason. Evelyn looked at the numbers, her mind already working through possibilities. Then we don't ask the king. We go around him. That's treason. I know. Evelyn's voice stayed level. But letting the kingdom collapse is worse. Brennan sat down heavily. What are you proposing? Evelyn pulled out a map of the kingdom and spread it across her desk. We control what we can control. The military already reports to me as much as to Cedric. The merchants trust my economic guidance more than the king's decrees. The northern provinces would follow me into fire after the grain distribution. She traced her finger along the map's key trade routes. If we quietly restructure the tax collection system to bypass the royal household entirely, route revenues through the military budget and regional governors instead of the central treasury, we can prevent Cedric from spending what he can't access. Brennan's eyes widened. You want to financially isolate the king. I want to protect the kingdom's resources from being wasted on corruption and excess. If that isolates the king, that's his choice, not mine. The Lord Chancellor was quiet for a long moment. Then, Your Majesty, if we do this, there's no going back. This is a direct challenge to royal authority. He challenged his own authority when he abandoned governance for his mistress. Evelyn's jaw tightened. I'm just dealing with the consequences. Brennan nodded slowly. I'll need time to implement this. We'll have to move carefully. If Cedric realizes what we're doing before the system is in place, he won't. He doesn't pay attention to financial structures. That's why this will work. And when he finally notices. Evelyn met Brennan's eyes. By then, the entire kingdom will be running on a system he doesn't control. What's he going to do? Dismantle the infrastructure keeping his people fed and his borders defended? You're betting he won't. I'm betting he can't. There's a difference. Over the following weeks, Evelyn moved like a chess player seeing 10 moves ahead. Every piece she placed looked innocent in isolation. A suggestion here, a policy adjustment there. Small changes that individually meant nothing. Together, they were a revolution. She established weekly meetings with regional governors, ostensibly to improve communication. In reality, she was building direct relationships that bypassed the royal court entirely. She created a new position, Royal Trade Liaison, and appointed a brilliant merchant named Petra Solvang, who understood commerce better than anyone in the kingdom. Petra reported directly to Evelyn, not the king. She convinced General Thorne to restructure military supply chains, routing them through a council of commanders instead of royal procurement officers. It improved efficiency. It also cut Cedric out of military spending. Every change came wrapped in reasonable justifications. Every shift in power looked like practical governance. Nobody seemed to notice that Eveline was systematically dismantling the king's control over his own kingdom. Nobody except Celine. The confrontation came during a state dinner celebrating some minor noble's daughter's wedding. The hall blazed with candles and expensive wine flowed like water. Cedric presided at the head table with Celine at his right hand, the placement a deliberate insult to Eveline, who sat 3 seats down. Eveline had stopped caring about the insults. They were background noise now. She was discussing grain futures with the Northern ambassador when Celine's voice cut across the conversation like a blade. "Tell me, Your Majesty," Celine said loudly enough to draw attention. "How does it feel to play at governance while real power rests elsewhere?" The nearby conversations died. Eveline set down her wine glass and turned to face Celine with a pleasant smile. "I wouldn't know," she said mildly. "I've never played at anything." Celine's eyes glittered. "Of course. You take your little projects very seriously. The grain distribution, the trade reforms. So industrious." The word dripped with condescension. "Someone has to be," Eveline replied. "Kingdoms don't run on wishes and parties." A few people within earshot shifted uncomfortably. This was dangerous territory. Nobody challenged Celine in public. But Eveline was done pretending to be intimidated. "Careful," Celine said, her voice dropping to something sharper. "You're speaking to the king's chosen companion, and you're speaking to the king's wife." Eveline's tone stayed conversational, but something in her eyes changed. The queen. The woman who actually knows how many soldiers guard our borders and how much grain feeds our people. "Do you know those numbers, Lady Celine?" Silence rippled outward from their exchange. Celine's face flushed. "I don't concern myself with tedious details." "No," Eveline agreed. "You concern yourself with spending resources you didn't earn on luxuries the kingdom can't afford. That must be so much more fulfilling." Gasps echoed through the hall. Cedric stood abruptly. "Eveline, that's enough." "Is it?" Eveline stood as well, facing her husband across the table. "Because I think we're just getting started. Your companion questions my role in governance, so let's discuss governance. When was the last time you attended a full council meeting? When did you last review military readiness reports? When did you make a single decision that prioritized the kingdom over your personal pleasures?" The hall had gone completely silent. Cedric's face went white, then red. "You forget yourself." "No, Your Majesty." "I've finally remembered myself." Eveline's voice carried to every corner of the room. "I remember that I was educated to rule, that I speak languages you don't, that I understand economics and military strategy, that I'm not decoration, I'm an asset you've been too distracted to use." She gestured to Celine without looking at her. "So forgive me if I don't take criticism from someone whose greatest contribution to this kingdom is looking pretty while it falls apart around her." Celine shot to her feet. "How dare you?" "I dare because someone has to," Eveline cut her off. "While you've been playing queen in everything but title, I've been doing the actual work. And the kingdom knows it." Cedric slammed his hand on the table. "Guards, escort the queen to her chambers." Nobody moved. Eveline saw the moment of realization cross Cedric's face. The guards were looking at General Thorne, who stood near the wall with his arms crossed, making no move to intervene. "Your Majesty," Thorne said carefully. "Perhaps this conversation should continue privately." "I gave an order," Cedric said, his voice rising. "And I'm suggesting discretion," Thorne replied. "Sir." The standoff lasted 5 heartbeats. Then Cedric turned and stormed from the hall, Celine hurrying after him. The remaining nobles erupted into frantic whispers. Eveline sat back down and picked up her wineglass with steady hands, though her heart hammered against her ribs like it wanted to escape. She'd just publicly humiliated the king, in front of the entire court. There would be consequences. But as conversation slowly resumed around her, Eveline noticed something. People were looking at her differently, not with pity or contempt, with calculation, with respect, with the kind of attention reserved for real power. Later that night, alone in her chambers, Eveline allowed herself to shake. The confrontation had been reckless, dangerous. It could have gone catastrophically wrong, but it hadn't, and that told her something crucial. Cedric's authority was hollow, built on tradition and assumption rather than actual loyalty or competence. She could break it. The question was whether she should. A knock interrupted her thoughts. General Thorne entered without waiting for permission, his expression grave. That was either brilliant or suicidal, he said bluntly. I haven't decided which. Neither have I. Eveline poured herself wine with hands that had finally stopped shaking. Will there be consequences? Oh, absolutely. Thorne accepted the wine she offered. The question is what kind? He pulled out a sealed letter and handed it to her. This arrived an hour ago, from the Northern Lords. Eveline broke the seal and read. The letter was short and direct. The Northern Territories stand with Queen Evelyn. Whatever she needs, she has our support. She looked up at Thorne. They're choosing sides. The whole kingdom is choosing sides, Your Majesty. Tonight made that inevitable. The general's voice dropped. You just forced every noble to decide whether they follow a king who neglects them or a queen who actually gives a damn. That wasn't my intention. Wasn't it? Eveline met his eyes and found she couldn't lie. Maybe it was. Thorne smiled grimly. Then congratulations. You just started a cold civil war. The question now is how we win it without the kingdom tearing itself apart. We win it by being indispensable, Eveline said. By making ourselves so critical to the kingdom's survival that removing us becomes unthinkable. And if the king tries anyway, then we'll know exactly where everyone's loyalty lies. Over the next month, the fracture lines became impossible to ignore. Cedric's court consisted of old nobility, traditional families who valued bloodline over competence, and people who benefited from the existing corruption. They threw parties and made proclamations and pretended everything was fine. Eveline's network consisted of everyone who actually ran the kingdom, the military commanders, the trade ministers, the regional governors, the merchant guilds. They held meetings and solved problems and kept the realm functioning. The two courts existed in the same palace but operated in parallel universes. And slowly, inevitably, Cedric's universe started collapsing. It began with small failures. A trade agreement that fell through because Cedric forgot to sign it. A military shipment delayed because the king's procurement officer was incompetent. A tax revolt in the eastern provinces that Cedric didn't even know about until Eveline's people had already resolved it. Then larger cracks appeared. Lord Davin Hartwick, the nobleman who'd sent the death threat, was caught embezzling from northern trade taxes. The evidence appeared on Eveline's desk, delivered by merchants who'd been keeping records for years but had never had anyone to report to who would actually act. Eveline sent the evidence to Cedric with a formal request for prosecution. Cedric buried it. Hartwick was Celine's cousin, so Eveline leaked the evidence to the merchant guilds instead. Within a week, Hartwick's business partners abandoned him. His trade licenses were quietly revoked by local governors. His wealth evaporated like morning fog. He was ruined without a single official charge being filed. The message was clear. The queen protected her people. Cross her network, and the kingdom itself would turn against you. More nobles started coming to Eveline instead of Cedric. Not openly, that would be treason, but through intermediaries, through carefully worded letters, through requests for audiences that were officially about trade policy, but actually about pledging loyalty. Eveline documented every contact, every promise, every shift in allegiance. Her list grew longer. Then came the incident that changed everything. A minor border dispute with the eastern kingdom of Aldermere threatened to escalate into war. The Aldermere king claimed Valmont soldiers had crossed into his territory and attacked a village. Cedric responded by mobilizing troops and making belligerent speeches about defending Valmont honor. Eveline investigated and discovered the truth. The attack had been staged by Aldermere nobles trying to provoke war for their own political reasons. The supposed Valmont soldiers were mercenaries in stolen uniforms. She had proof, documents, witness testimony, everything needed to resolve the crisis diplomatically. She brought it to Cedric during a council meeting. He barely glanced at it. We're already committed to military action, he said dismissively. Changing course now makes us look weak. It makes us look intelligent, Eveline countered. We avoid a war based on lies and save thousands of lives. The king has decided, Celine interjected from her position beside Cedric's chair. The matter is closed. Eveline looked around the council table. Half the ministers looked uncomfortable. The other half looked terrified. General Thorne cleared his throat. Your Majesty, with respect, the Queen's intelligence is solid. If we attack based on false pretenses, then we attack, Cedric snapped. I will not be second-guessed by my wife. Even when your wife is right, Evelyn said quietly. Especially then. The words hung in the air like a confession. Cedric stood. This council is dismissed. We march in 3 days. After he left, the remaining ministers looked at each other with barely concealed panic. General Thorne approached Evelyn. Your Majesty, if we go to war over this, it will be a disaster. Aldermere has twice our naval power and alliances with 3 neighboring kingdoms. I know, Evelyn said. Then what do we do? Evelyn made a decision that would define everything that came after. We stop him. Thorne went very still. Your Majesty, that's... I know what it is. Evelyn's voice was steady as stone. But I'm not watching thousands die because the king is too proud to admit he's wrong. How do you propose we stop him? Evelyn looked at the general, at Lord Chancellor Brennan, at the finance minister and the trade minister, and every other person in the room who'd been working with her for months. We do exactly what we've been doing, she said. We govern. The king can make all the proclamations he wants, but if the military doesn't move, if the resources don't flow, if the orders don't get executed, then nothing happens. You're talking about mutiny, someone whispered. I'm talking about preventing a catastrophic war, Evelyn corrected. The king is welcome to change his mind any time he wants. Until then, we protect the kingdom from his mistakes. Silence descended like a physical weight. Then General Thorne spoke. The military will not mobilize, he said quietly. Not for this. Not based on lies. Brennan nodded slowly. The Treasury will not release war funds. One by one, every minister in the room pledged the same thing. Loyalty to the kingdom over loyalty to the king's bad judgment. Evelyn felt the moment like a physical shift. This was the point of no return. They'd just committed collective treason, or they'd saved the kingdom. History would decide which. 3 days later, Cedric discovered that his orders had been ignored. The troops hadn't mobilized. The funds hadn't been released. The diplomatic channels he'd closed had been quietly reopened by Evelyn's people, who'd used her evidence to prove Valmont's innocence to Aldermere. The war that almost started never happened. Cedric's rage was incandescent. He summoned Evelyn to the throne room in front of the full court. She arrived to find him standing beside the throne, Celine at his side, his face purple with fury. You countermanded my orders, he shouted before she'd fully entered. You undermined my authority. You committed treason. I prevented a war, Evelyn replied calmly. A war based on lies that would have destroyed this kingdom. That was not your decision to make. Then whose decision was it? Evelyn walked forward until she stood in the center of the throne room, every eye on her. Yours. You're absolutely right. You're the king. You have the authority to declare war, to mobilize armies, to risk everything on your pride. She paused, letting the words settle. But authority without wisdom is just power without purpose. And I won't watch you destroy this kingdom because you're too stubborn to admit when you're wrong. Guards, Cedric snarled. Arrest her! Nobody moved. Cedric looked around wildly. I gave you an order. General Thorne stepped forward. Your Majesty, arresting the Queen would require charges. What charges are you filing? Treason. Insubordination. Cedric's voice cracked slightly. Conspiracy against the crown. Conspiracy to prevent an unjust war, Evelyn said clearly. Conspiracy to protect the kingdom's resources. Conspiracy to govern when you refuse to. She turned to address the assembled court. Every person in this room knows the truth. The king abandoned governance months ago. While he celebrated and indulged and ignored his responsibilities, someone had to keep this kingdom running. Someone had to feed the people, defend the borders, maintain the trade routes. Her voice rang out strong and clear. I didn't take power. I picked up the pieces you dropped. And if that's treason, then arrest me. But know that you'll be arresting the person who's been holding this kingdom together while you partied with your mistress. The throne room erupted into shocked murmurs. Cedric looked around at the nobles, the ministers, the guards, looking for support, for loyalty, for someone to validate his authority. But the faces looking back were calculating, measuring, wondering what came next. Celine grabbed Cedric's arm and whispered urgently in his ear. He shook her off. Fine, he said hoarsely. You want to govern. You want to undermine me. We'll see how the kingdom responds to a queen who openly defies her king. He turned and strode from the throne room, Celine following. The silence he left behind was deafening. Eveline stood alone in the center of the room and realized she'd just crossed a line she could never uncross. This wasn't a cold civil war anymore. This was open conflict, and the entire kingdom would have to choose sides. The Winter Council convened 6 weeks after the throne room confrontation, and Eveline walked into it knowing this was the battlefield where everything would be decided. The Great Hall felt colder than usual, despite fires blazing in every hearth. Representatives from every major noble house filled the chamber. Northern lords in heavy furs, southern merchants in silk, military commanders in polished armor. The air smelled like ambition and fear in equal measure. Cedric sat on the throne with Celine standing behind him like a venomous shadow. He looked smaller somehow, as if the weight of his failing authority had physically diminished him. Eveline took her position at the opposite end of the hall, flanked by General Thorne and Lord Chancellor Brennan. The room divided cleanly down the middle, Cedric's loyalists on one side, Eveline's network on the other. The kingdom split in half, visible in the arrangement of bodies. Lord Matthias Corvain rose to speak first. He was old nobility, wealthy from generations of inherited land, and loyal to tradition above all else. His voice carried the weight of centuries. "We are here because the natural order has been disrupted," he began. "Because a foreign queen has overstepped her station and challenged the divine right of kings to rule." Eveline kept her face perfectly neutral, but her fingers tightened on the armrest of her chair. Divine right. They were actually using that argument. The queen has interfered in matters of state, military deployment, and royal finances, Corvain continued. She has countermanded the king's orders and built a shadow government that answers to her instead of the crown. This is treason by any definition. Several nobles murmured agreement. Then Lord Adrian Westmarch stood. He was younger, practical, a northern lord whose territories Eveline had saved from starvation. His voice cut through the murmurs like steel. "And what would you call a king who abandons his duties?" he said flatly. "Who ignores military threats, bankrupts the treasury for personal pleasure, and would have led us into an unjust war that would have destroyed half the kingdom." The silence that followed was sharp as broken glass. "The king's personal life is irrelevant," Corvain snapped. "Is it?" Westmarch gestured to Cedric. "When that personal life affects his judgment, his priorities, his ability to govern, how is that irrelevant? The queen didn't seize power. She filled a void the king created." Cedric stood abruptly, his face flushed. "I will not be lectured about governance by men who conspire with my wife behind my back." "There's no conspiracy," Eveline said quietly, but her voice carried. "There's just competence. Something your court seems to have forgotten the meaning of." "Watch your tongue," Celine hissed from behind the throne. Eveline turned her gaze on the mistress, and something in her expression made Celine take a half step back. "Or what? You'll have the king issue another order that gets ignored. You'll threaten consequences that never materialize. You'll pretend you have power you've never actually earned." "Enough," Cedric shouted. "All of you. This council will address the accusations against the queen and determine appropriate punishment." "Punishment for what?" General Thorne said, standing. "For preventing a war. For feeding starving provinces. For doing the work you refuse to do. For undermining the crown," Corvain shot back. "The crown undermined itself," Brennan interjected. "We're simply dealing with the aftermath." The hall erupted into shouting. Nobles on their feet, accusations flying, the careful veneer of civility shattering like thin ice. Eveline watched it all with a strange sense of detachment. This was the moment she'd been building toward for months. The confrontation that would force the kingdom to choose. She just hadn't expected it to feel so much like watching something die. Then Lord Davin Hartwick stood, and Eveline felt her stomach drop. Hartwick should have been ruined, his business destroyed, his reputation demolished, but he stood there in expensive clothes with a smile that promised blood. "I have evidence," he announced loudly enough to cut through the chaos. "Evidence of the queen's true intentions." The hall went silent. Eveline's mind raced. What evidence? She'd been careful, meticulous, every move documented, every decision justified. Hartwick pulled out a sealed packet of letters and handed them to Corvain, who began reading aloud. "These are correspondences between Queen Eveline and her brother in the Ashcombe territories." He paused for effect. Letters discussing plans to destabilize Valmont from within, to turn the nobility against the king, and ultimately to seize the throne for herself. Eveline felt the floor drop out from under her. No. She'd never written anything like that. Her letters to her brother had been personal, venting frustrations, but never— "The letters are forgeries," she said clearly. "Convenient," Celine purred. "The guilty always claim innocence." "Show me the letters," Eveline demanded. Corvain held them up, and even from across the hall, Eveline could see they were written in handwriting that looked like hers, close enough to convince anyone who wasn't an expert. Her brother's seal was on the replies, perfectly duplicated. Someone had been planning this for a long time. "These letters prove the Queen is a foreign agent," Corvain declared, "sent here to undermine our kingdom from within. Every action she's taken, the alliances she's built, the power she's consolidated, has been in service of conquest, not governance." Eveline felt rage and fear warring in her chest. This was brilliant in its cruelty. Take everything she'd actually accomplished and reframe it as enemy action. Make her competence look like sabotage. General Thorne was already shaking his head. "This is absurd. The Queen has saved this kingdom repeatedly. Or she's created crises to solve so we'd trust her," Hartwick interrupted. "It's the oldest trick in the world. Poison the well, then offer the cure." Eveline watched nobles who'd supported her start to look uncertain, doubt spreading like infection. "I want those letters examined by experts," she said. "The handwriting analyzed, the seals authenticated." "There's no time for that," Cedric said, and something in his voice made Eveline's blood run cold. "The evidence is clear. You've been playing us all from the beginning." He didn't believe it. Eveline could see that in his eyes, but he was using it anyway. A convenient excuse to remove the wife who'd made him look weak. "Your Majesty." Brennan stepped forward. "This requires proper investigation. We can't make accusations of treason based on documents that appeared conveniently when— "The documents are authenticated by House Hartwick's reputation," Corvain cut him off. "Unless you're suggesting Lord Hartwick is lying." "I'm suggesting someone is," Brennan said flatly. "And forged letters are easy to produce if you have resources and motivation." "Are you accusing me of forgery?" Hartwick said dangerously. "I'm accusing someone of trying to destroy the one person who's been holding this kingdom together." The hall erupted again, louder this time. Accusations and counter-accusations flying like arrows. And through it all, Eveline felt something inside her shift. This wasn't just political maneuvering anymore. This was orchestrated destruction. Someone had been planning this for weeks, maybe months, gathering her handwriting samples, forging letters, waiting for the perfect moment to deploy them. She looked at Celine, who smiled back with poisonous satisfaction. Of course, Celine had the resources, the motivation, the access to Eveline's correspondence through servants and spies. She'd been building this trap while Eveline had been focused on governance, and Eveline had walked right into it. "Silence," Cedric commanded, and the hall gradually quieted. "The accusations against the Queen are severe, but they align with her behavior, her constant interference, her building of personal loyalty over royal authority, her systematic undermining of my reign." He stood and descended from the throne, walking toward Eveline like a judge approaching the condemned. "You said you were helping," he said quietly, "but all along you were conquering, turning my kingdom against me piece by piece." "That's not true," Eveline said, and hated how defensive she sounded. "Isn't it?" Cedric gestured to the room. "Half the nobility answers to you now. The military takes your orders over mine. The treasury operates by your systems. You've built a parallel government and claimed it was for the kingdom's good." "It was," Eveline insisted. "Everything I did was to keep this realm from collapsing, or to prepare it for new rule." Cedric's voice hardened. "Your rule." Eveline stood to face him directly. "If I'd wanted to rule, I could have done it already. Half the kingdom would follow me. You know that. Everyone in this room knows that." The admission hung in the air like a confession. "Then why didn't you?" Cedric asked. "Because I'm not a traitor." Eveline's voice cracked slightly. "Because despite everything, despite the humiliation, despite the neglect, despite being abandoned on my wedding night for your mistress, I still believed in the kingdom more than my own wounded pride." She looked around at the assembled nobles. "I could have let the North starve. I could have let that war happen. I could have watched this kingdom tear itself apart and claimed the pieces afterward. But I didn't. I saved you, all of you. and this is how you repay me." "Pretty words," Celine said from the throne. "But the letters tell a different story." "The letters are lies," Evelyn shot back. "Prove it," Celine challenged. And there was the trap closing completely. Evelyn couldn't prove it. Not quickly, not definitively. And in the court of public opinion, perception mattered more than truth. She was out of moves. The realization settled over her like ice water. She'd been outmaneuvered, not by superior intelligence or better strategy, but by simple ruthlessness. Celine had been willing to forge documents, to manufacture treason, to burn everything down just to destroy Evelyn. And it was working. Lord Corvain stood again. "Your Majesty, the evidence demands action. I move that Queen Evelyn be stripped of all titles and authority, placed under house arrest pending formal treason charges, and that her network of conspirators be investigated." Several nobles voiced agreement. General Thorne's hand dropped to his sword. "That's not happening." Every guard in the room tensed. "Careful, General," Cedric said. "You're very close to committing treason yourself." "I'm very close to preventing a coup," Thorne corrected. "These charges are manufactured. Anyone with eyes can see it." "Can they?" Corvain challenged. "Or are you so blinded by loyalty to the Queen that you'll defend treason?" "I defend the truth." "The truth," Cedric said coldly, "is that my wife has systematically dismantled my authority and turned half my kingdom against me. Whether she planned it from the beginning or simply seized opportunities as they came, the result is the same. She cannot be allowed to continue." "Then what do you propose?" Evelyn asked quietly. Cedric met her eyes, and she saw something there that chilled her. Not anger, but calculation. He'd made a decision. "You will publicly renounce all involvement in governance," he said. "You will dissolve your network and acknowledge my sole authority. You will withdraw to the Queen's quarters and remain there, acting as a proper consort should." He paused. "Or you will face formal treason charges, trial, and likely execution." The hall went dead silent. Evelyn felt the choice crushing down on her like physical weight. Submit and lose everything she'd built, become the decorative wife she'd refused to be, watch the kingdom slide back into dysfunction. Or fight and risk not just her life, but civil war. There was no good option, no clever solution, just two paths, both leading to destruction. She looked at General Thorne, at Brennan, at the Northern lords and military commanders and merchants who'd pledged loyalty. She saw their faces and knew. If she chose to fight, they would fight with her. The kingdom would tear itself in half. Thousands would die. Evelyn closed her eyes and felt something inside her break. Not violently, quietly, like a foundation crumbling under too much pressure. When she opened them again, something had changed in her expression. Something had hardened beyond any softness she'd ever allowed herself. "Very well," she said. "Your Majesty," Thorne started. She held up a hand, silencing him. "I will not watch this kingdom burn in civil war because of me. I will not be responsible for the deaths of innocents caught in a power struggle." She turned to Cedric. "I accept your terms. I will withdraw from governance. I will dissolve my networks. I will be the quiet, obedient wife you wanted from the beginning." Relief washed over Cedric's face. "Good. That's—" "But," Evelyn continued, and her voice cut like a knife. "Before I do, I want the full court to hear this. I want every person in this room to understand what you're choosing." She faced the assembled nobles. "I saved the northern territories from starvation. I prevented an unjust war. I restructured the economy to benefit everyone instead of just the corrupt. I made this kingdom stronger, safer, and more prosperous than it's been in a generation." Her voice grew stronger. "And you're throwing that away because it bruised the king's ego, because competence in a woman is more threatening than incompetence in a man, because you'd rather have comfortable corruption than uncomfortable excellence." She let that sink in. "So fine. Go back to your old ways. Let the king make decisions based on his mistress's pillow talk. Let the treasury bleed dry. Let the borders go undefended. See how long this kingdom lasts without someone actually doing the work." "Evelyn," Cedric warned. "I'm done," she said flatly. "You won. Congratulations." She turned and walked toward the exit, her back straight, her head high. Guards moved to intercept her. "Let her go," Cedric said tiredly. "She's accepted the terms." The guards parted. As Evelyn reached the doorway, Lord Westmarch called out, "Your Majesty." She stopped but didn't turn. The North remembers, he said quietly. What you did for us. We won't forget. Evelyn nodded once and left the hall. The walk back to her chambers felt like walking to her own execution, every step echoing in empty corridors, every breath heavy with defeat. She'd lost. After months of building, planning, fighting, she'd been outmaneuvered by a woman willing to lie and a king too weak to see the truth. Evelyn reached her chambers and closed the door behind her. The room felt like a cage now, familiar and suffocating. She stood in the center of the room and let herself feel it. The rage, the grief, the crushing weight of failure. Then she heard footsteps outside. The door opened. Celine walked in without knocking, her smile sharp as broken glass. Came to gloat, Evelyn said flatly. Actually, yes. Celine settled into a chair like a cat claiming territory. I wanted to see your face when you realized you lost. Evelyn turned to face her. The letters were forgeries. Obviously. Celine examined her nails. But good forgeries. My people are very talented. Why? Why do you think? Celine's eyes glittered. You were a threat. Not to Cedric. He's too stupid to see past his own wounded pride. But to me, you were showing the kingdom what real power looks like, and that made my position vulnerable. So you destroyed me. I neutralized you. There's a difference. Celine stood and walked closer. You're still alive, still queen. You just don't matter anymore. Evelyn felt something cold and sharp crystallize in her chest. You're right. I don't matter. Not anymore. She smiled, and it was the smile of someone who'd stopped caring about rules. But here's what you didn't consider, Celine. You didn't just defeat me. You showed me exactly what kind of war this is. The kind where honor doesn't matter, where truth doesn't matter, where the only thing that matters is being willing to do whatever it takes. Celine's smile faltered slightly. I was playing by civilized rules, Evelyn continued. Building legitimately, governing honestly, being the better person, and you crushed me for it. She took a step toward Celine. Thank you. Because now I know better. Now I understand that if I want to win, I need to think like you, fight like you, be willing to destroy anything and anyone who stands in my way. That sounds like a threat, Celine said carefully. It's a promise. Evelyn's voice dropped to something deadly quiet. I accepted Cedric's terms because I won't let innocent people die in a civil war. But I never said I'd stop fighting. You have no power now. I have something better. I have nothing left to lose. Evelyn felt it settling into her bones, a transformation from the woman who'd tried to do things right into something colder and more dangerous. You took my authority. Fine. But you can't take my intelligence, my connections, my understanding of how this kingdom actually works. What are you going to do? Celine scoffed. You're confined to quarters, for now. Evelyn walked to the window and looked out over the palace grounds. But kingdoms are fragile things, Celine, and people in power forget how quickly circumstances can change. One crisis, one scandal, one moment where Cedric needs someone who actually knows how to govern. She turned back. I'll be waiting. And when that moment comes, and it will come, I won't make the mistake of being merciful again. Celine stared at her, and for the first time, Evelyn saw genuine uncertainty in the other woman's eyes. You're bluffing. Am I? Evelyn's smile widened. I guess we'll find out. Celine stood and moved toward the door, her composure cracking slightly. You're beaten. Accept it. I've been beaten before, Evelyn said. On my wedding night, when your king chose you over me. I thought it would destroy me. Instead, it forged me into something harder than he ever expected. She met Celine's eyes. So go ahead. Enjoy your victory. But remember this conversation when everything you've built starts crumbling. Because I'm done playing fair, and you have no idea what I'm actually capable of when I stop trying to be good. Celine fled. Evelyn stood alone in her chambers and felt the transformation complete itself. She'd tried to save the kingdom through competence and honor. That had failed. So now she would save it through calculation and ruthlessness instead. The woman who'd wanted to be a good queen was dead. What rose in her place was something the kingdom had never seen before. A strategist with nothing to lose, no rules left to follow, and the intelligence to dismantle everything Cedric and Celine had built piece by methodical piece. They thought they'd won by forcing her into submission. They'd actually just created their worst nightmare. Evelyn walked to her desk and pulled out fresh parchment. Her hand was steady as she began to write. Not letters this time, but plans. Contingencies. Options for scenarios that hadn't happened yet but would. Because if this kingdom wanted to treat her like an enemy, she would show them what a real enemy looked like. Not loud, not dramatic, just patient and thorough and absolutely merciless. She wrote until dawn, filling page after page with possibilities. Ways to destabilize without being caught. How to turn Cedric's supporters against each other. Where Celine's power was weakest. And slowly, methodically, she began to see the shape of her revenge. Not revenge born of anger, that was too hot, too impulsive. Revenge born of ice-cold calculation and the kind of patience that could wait years if necessary. The kingdom thought Evelyn Ashcombe had been defeated. They were wrong. She just learned how to stop fighting like a queen and start fighting like something infinitely more dangerous. A woman with intelligence, resources, and absolutely nothing left to lose. 3 months of silence had taught Evelyn more about power than 3 years of governance ever could. Confined to her quarters, stripped of authority, watched by guards who reported her every movement, she'd become invisible. A ghost haunting the palace while Cedric and Celine celebrated their victory with increasingly lavish parties that drained what remained of the treasury. But invisible meant underestimated, and underestimated meant dangerous. Evelyn spent those months watching, learning, waiting for the kingdom to remember why it had needed her in the first place. She didn't have to wait long. The first crack appeared when winter storms destroyed half the coastal fleet. Cedric's response was to blame the harbor master and throw a festival to lift spirits. The merchants who'd lost ships and cargo quietly sent word to Evelyn through her handmaid, asking what should be done. She wrote back with detailed instructions for temporary trade route adjustments, delivered through servants who moved through the palace like ghosts themselves. The second crack came when border skirmishes with Aldermere resumed. General Thorne requested an audience with the king 3 times. Cedric canceled each one, distracted by Celine's latest demands for new jewelry. Thorne sent a coded message to Evelyn instead. She responded with strategic recommendations that kept the borders stable without requiring the king's input. The third crack was corruption. Without Evelyn's oversight, the old systems of embezzlement and graft had returned like rot spreading through timber. Tax collectors pocketed revenues. Supply officers sold military provisions to line their own pockets. Ministers who'd grown fat under previous kings resumed their theft. Lord Chancellor Brennan documented everything and smuggled the records to Evelyn piece by piece. And through it all, Celine tightened her grip on Cedric, whispering poison in his ear about loyalty and strength, and how removing Evelyn had proven his authority. The kingdom began to fracture, slowly at first, then faster. Evelyn watched it happen from her gilded cage and felt no satisfaction, only cold calculation. She'd learned the most important lesson of her life during those 3 months. Sometimes the best way to prove you were right was to let your enemies prove they were wrong. She just had to be patient enough to let the collapse happen naturally. The breaking point came on a frozen morning in late winter. Evelyn was reading intelligence reports Brennan had smuggled in, disguised as poetry, because Celine's spies wouldn't bother checking literature, when her door burst open. General Thorne stood there, still in mud-spattered armor, his face carved from granite. "We need to talk, now." The guards started to intervene, but Thorne's hand dropped to his sword and something in his expression made them step back. He closed the door and turned to Evelyn. "The northern garrison has fallen. Aldermere forces crossed the border 3 days ago. They've taken 2 major towns and they're moving south." Evelyn felt ice flood her veins. "How many casualties?" "We don't know yet. Hundreds at least, maybe thousands." Thorne's jaw tightened. The king still hasn't responded. Celine convinced him it's an exaggeration, that the commanders are trying to undermine his authority, while people die. While people die. Thorne met her eyes. "Your Majesty, I'm not here for advice. I'm here to ask you a direct question. Ask, will you help us stop this, even though it means openly defying the king's confinement order?" Evelyn stood slowly, her mind already working through military logistics she'd kept sharp during months of forced inactivity. "If I help, Cedric will charge me with treason. Real treason this time. I know. If I help, there will be consequences. For me. For everyone who supports me. For the stability of the realm. I know that too. Thorn's voice dropped. But people are dying right now because the king won't act, so I'm asking, will you help them anyway? Evelyn felt the weight of the decision crushing down on her. This was the moment, the point where she either stayed safe in her cage or stepped back into the war she'd tried to walk away from. She thought about the northern territories, the people she'd saved from starvation, the families who'd sent her letters thanking her for caring when their own king didn't. They were dying now. While Cedric partied and Celine smiled. Get me a map, Evelyn said. And Zhao Ji, everyone who's willing to act without the king's permission. Thorn smiled grimly. Already done. They're waiting in the old armory. 20 minutes later, Evelyn walked into a room she hadn't entered in months and found it filled with the people who'd built the kingdom's actual infrastructure. Military commanders, trade ministers, regional governors, even some nobles who'd quietly supported Cedric but could no longer ignore reality. They looked at her with expressions mixing hope and desperation. Lord Chancellor Brennan stepped forward. Your Majesty, thank you for coming. Save the formalities. Evelyn moved to the large table where maps of the kingdom were spread out. Show me the current situation. General Thorn pointed to marks on the northern border. Aldermere forces here, here, and here. They're moving in a pincer formation, trying to cut off our supply lines before pushing toward the capital. Evelyn studied the map, her mind clicking through possibilities like chess moves. They're exploiting the gaps we never filled because Cedric kept canceling military funding requests. Exactly. How many troops can we mobilize without the king's authorization? About 3,000, Thorn said. Maybe 4 if we pull from non-critical positions. That's not enough for a direct confrontation. Evelyn traced the enemy positions, but it might be enough for a strategic defense if we're smart about it. She looked up at the assembled commanders. Here's what we're going to do. We don't have the numbers to win a straight fight, so we won't fight one. We'll use the terrain against them, force them into defensive positions where their numbers don't matter. She pointed to a narrow valley north of the captured towns. We funnel them here. It's the fastest route to the capital, so they'll take it. But it's also a choke point. We fortify the high ground, rain hell down on them from above, and turn their advance into a nightmare. What about the towns they've already taken? Someone asked. We let them keep those for now. Evelyn's voice was cold and practical. We don't have the forces to retake them and defend the capital, so we choose the capital. Once we've broken their advance, we can negotiate for the town's return. That means abandoning people, Lord Westmarch said quietly. It means saving the kingdom, Evelyn corrected. And those people are already under Aldermere control. We can't help them by getting slaughtered trying to be heroes. The room went silent as everyone absorbed the brutal calculus. This is triage, Evelyn continued. We save what we can save and accept what we can't. I don't like it any more than you do, but it's the reality of our situation. She looked around the room. Now, who's with me? One by one, every person in the room nodded. Good. Thorn, start mobilizing troops immediately. I want units moving north within 6 hours. What do I tell them about authorization? Thorn asked. Tell them the Queen commands it. Evelyn's voice hardened. If they have a problem with that, they can take it up with the king after we've saved his kingdom. And when the king finds out what we're doing, Brennan said carefully. Let him. Evelyn felt something fierce and unbreakable settle into her chest. I'm done hiding. I'm done being quiet. People are dying because Cedric won't lead, so I will. That's treason, someone whispered. That's survival. Evelyn met each person's eyes in turn. And if we succeed, if we save this kingdom from invasion, then Cedric can decide whether he wants to execute the woman who saved his throne or admit he needed her. The room erupted into activity. Commanders dispatching orders, ministers coordinating supply lines, the machinery of governance spinning back to life after months of dysfunction. Evelyn worked through the logistics with a clarity that felt like coming home. This was what she'd been built for, not parties or pretty dresses or being a decorative wife. War, strategy, the ruthless calculus of keeping a kingdom alive. 6 hours later, troops began moving north under cover of darkness. By morning, they'd reached the valley Evelyn had identified and started fortifying positions. By the time Cedric found out what was happening, it was too late to stop it. The confrontation came at dawn the next day. Evelyn was in the war room reviewing troop positions when the doors slammed open. Cedric strode in with Celine and a contingent of guards, his face purple with rage. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he shouted. "Saving your kingdom." Evelyn didn't look up from the maps. "You're welcome. I gave explicit orders that you were confined to quarters, that you had no authority, that your explicit orders were killing people." Evelyn finally looked at him, and her expression was carved from ice. "While you were throwing parties, Aldermere was invading. While you were buying jewelry for your mistress, our northern territories were burning. That's not... It's exactly true." Evelyn stood. "I have casualty reports, town-by-town accounts of the damage, letters from families whose children are dead because you wouldn't respond to military warnings." She pulled out a stack of documents and threw them on the table. "Read them. See what your negligence cost." Cedric stared at the papers like they might bite him. "You had no right," Celine hissed. "The king's authority? The king's authority means nothing if there's no kingdom left to rule." Evelyn's voice cut like a whip. "I'm not interested in abstract debates about power while real people die." "You're committing treason," Cedric said, but his voice wavered. "Then charge me." Evelyn moved around the table to face him directly. "Arrest me. Execute me. Do whatever you need to do to feel powerful again, but do it after we've stopped the invasion, because right now I'm the only thing standing between you and complete military collapse." The words hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Cedric looked at the maps, at the troop positions, at the strategic plans laid out in Evelyn's handwriting. "What are you doing?" he asked quietly. "Winning." Evelyn pointed to the valley position. "We don't have enough troops for a direct fight, so we're using terrain and strategy instead. The enemy is moving into a choke point where we can defend from high ground. If it works, we break their advance and force them to negotiate. And if it doesn't work, then we all die together, and it won't matter who had authority." Cedric was silent for a long moment. Then, "How long until the engagement?" 12 hours. Maybe less." Evelyn checked the latest intelligence reports. "They're moving faster than expected." "Because they think we're weak," Celine said suddenly. "Because they've heard about the internal divisions, about a king who can't control his own wife." Evelyn turned to look at her, and something in that gaze made Celine take a step back. "They think we're weak because we are weak," Evelyn said quietly. "Because we've spent months fighting each other instead of defending the realm. Because you convinced the king that pride mattered more than competence." She looked back at Cedric. "So here we are. The kingdom is under attack. I've mobilized a defense without your permission because you wouldn't give it. You can stop me, but that means stopping the only plan we have to survive this." She spread her hands. "Choose your wounded pride or your kingdom's survival. You can't have both." Cedric looked at Celine, who opened her mouth to speak. "Don't," he said sharply. Celine froze. Cedric turned back to Evelyn, and for the first time in months, she saw something in his eyes that wasn't anger or resentment. It looked almost like respect. "Finish it," he said. "Do whatever you need to do to stop them. Does that mean I have your authorization?" "It means I'm not going to stop you." Cedric's jaw tightened. "After this is over, we'll discuss the consequences. But right now, save the kingdom." He turned and left without another word. Celine followed, her expression twisted with fury. The door closed behind them. Evelyn let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "That went better than expected," Brennan said dryly. "It went exactly as expected." Evelyn returned to the maps. "He's a weak king, but he's not stupid. He knows we're his only chance." "And after?" Thorne asked. "When this is over and we've won or lost, what happens then?" "Then we find out if he's grateful or vengeful." Evelyn's expression hardened. "But we'll worry about that after we've survived." The battle began at dusk. Evelyn watched from a command post on the high ground, surrounded by runners who brought constant updates from the front lines. She'd wanted to be closer to the fighting, but Thorne had refused to let her risk herself. "You're too valuable," he'd said. "We need your mind, not your sword arm." So she stood on a hillside and watched her strategy unfold like a deadly choreography. The Aldermere forces moved into the valley exactly as predicted, their commanders confident in their superior numbers. They saw the fortified positions on the high ground but assumed they could overwhelm them through sheer force. They were wrong. The first volley of arrows darkened the sky, then the second, then the third. Aldermere soldiers fell by the dozens, unable to reach the high ground positions effectively. But they kept coming. Eveline watched through the gathering darkness as bodies piled up in the narrow valley, as her own soldiers held position despite the screams and chaos below, as the brutal mathematics of war played out in real time. She felt every death like a physical weight. These were her decisions, her strategy, her responsibility. This was the price of leadership nobody talked about in the histories. Not the glory of victory, but the crushing burden of sending people to die because it was necessary. The fighting continued through the night. Wave after wave of Aldermere soldiers trying to break through. Wave after wave falling to disciplined volleys from defenders who held position because their queen had asked them to. By dawn, the valley floor was carpeted with bodies, and the Aldermere advance had stopped. A runner arrived with the news as the sun rose bloody over the battlefield. "Your Majesty, the enemy is requesting terms for negotiation." Eveline felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since the fighting started. "Send word that we'll negotiate. But our terms are non-negotiable. Complete withdrawal from Valmont territory and reparations for the towns they damaged. What if they refuse? Then we resume hostilities." Eveline's voice was flat. "But they won't. They came here expecting an easy victory and found a bloodbath instead. They'll negotiate." She was right. By midday, Aldermere envoys arrived under flag of truce. By evening, terms had been agreed, complete withdrawal within 3 days, reparations paid over the next year, a formal apology from the Aldermere king for the unprovoked invasion. Valmont had won. The cost was visible in the exhausted faces of soldiers staggering back from the front lines, in the casualty reports that listed names of men and women who'd died defending their kingdom, in the families who'd lost loved ones because their king had been too distracted to prevent the invasion in the first place. Eveline read every name, memorized every face from the identification drawings the commanders provided. These people had died following her orders. She would never forget them. General Thorne found her as the sun set on the second day after the battle. "We won," he said quietly. "Against superior numbers and long odds, we won." "We survived," Eveline corrected. "There's a difference. The troops don't see it that way. They're calling you the Iron Queen, the woman who saved the kingdom when the king wouldn't. That's dangerous talk. That's the truth." Thorne sat down beside her. "Your Majesty, what you did here, the strategy, the logistics, the sheer force of will, it's going to change everything." "How?" "Because the entire kingdom just watched you save them, not through politics or manipulation, but through competence and courage. They know who kept them alive, and it wasn't the man wearing the crown." Eveline looked out over the valley where burial details were still working, giving the dead proper rites. "That's what terrifies me," she said quietly, "because now Cedric has to choose. Admit I was right and lose face, or punish me for being right and prove he values his pride over the kingdom. What do you think he'll do?" "I think Celine will make that choice for him." Eveline's jaw tightened. "And she'll choose punishment, because anything else threatens her position. Then we need to be ready." "For what?" "For whatever comes next." Thorne's hand dropped to his sword. "Because if the king tries to arrest you now, after this, there will be consequences." "Don't," Eveline said sharply. "Don't start a civil war over me. It wouldn't be over you. It would be over the principle of whether competence matters more than birthright. That's the same thing." "No, Your Majesty, it's not." They sat in silence as darkness fell completely, both knowing that the real battle hadn't been fought yet. That battle was waiting for them back at the palace. The return to the capital took 3 days. Eveline rode at the head of the column with General Thorne and the commanders who'd won the battle. Behind them marched soldiers who'd held the line when it mattered most. Citizens lined the streets to watch them pass, and their cheers weren't for the king. They were for her. The palace came into view on the 3rd day, its towers rising against a gray sky that promised rain. Eveline felt her stomach tighten. This was it, the moment where everything would be decided. As they approached the main gates, she saw Cedric waiting with the full court assembled behind him. Celine stood at his right hand, her expression carefully neutral. The gates opened. Eveline rode through them and dismounted in the main courtyard, facing her husband across 20 feet of paving stones that might as well have been a chasm. "Your Majesty," she said formally, "I'm pleased to report that the invasion has been repelled." Aldermere has withdrawn and agreed to reparations. I heard, Cedric said. His voice was flat, unreadable. The silence stretched. Then Cedric descended from his position and walked toward her. The court held its collective breath. He stopped 3 feet away. You disobeyed my explicit orders, he said. I did. You mobilized troops without authorization. I did. You took command of my military and waged war in my name without permission. I did all of that, Eveline agreed, because you wouldn't, because people were dying and you refused to act. Cedric's jaw tightened. And now you return victorious, expecting what? Gratitude, forgiveness. I expect nothing. Eveline kept her voice level. I did what needed to be done. The consequences are yours to decide. Cedric stared at her, and Eveline could see the war raging behind his eyes. Pride against practicality, authority against competence, everything he wanted to be against everything he actually was. Finally, he spoke. The Queen will be placed under arrest, he announced loudly enough for the entire court to hear, for treason, insubordination, and unlawful military action. Gasps rippled through the assembled nobles. General Thorne's hand dropped to his sword. Your Majesty, with respect. The general will stand down, Cedric snapped, unless he wishes to join her. Eveline put a hand on Thorne's arm. Don't. Your Majesty, he said urgently. I said don't. She looked back at Cedric. I understand. You need to assert your authority, so do it. She held out her hands for shackles. Cedric gestured, and guards moved forward uncertainly. But before they could reach her, the courtyard gates opened again. A rider thundered through, his horse lathered with sweat, his uniform marked with the Northern Territory's colors. He dismounted and ran straight to Eveline, dropping to one knee. Your Majesty, he gasped. Message from Lord Westmarch. The Northern Territories formally petition for your intervention in governance. They refuse to recognize any authority that would arrest the woman who saved their lives. He pulled out a sealed document. Behind him, more riders appeared, dozens of them. From every region Eveline had helped during her months of governance. One by one, they delivered the same message. Their territories stood with the Queen. Cedric's face went white, because everyone present understood what this meant. The kingdom wasn't choosing between Cedric and Eveline anymore. It had already chosen. And Eveline stood at the center of the courtyard, hands still extended for shackles that would never come, and knew that everything was about to change in ways nobody could control. The courtyard stood frozen in a tableau that would be painted and debated for generations. Cedric with his hand half raised for arrest that couldn't happen. Eveline with her hands extended for shackles that wouldn't come. And between them, dozens of riders bearing messages that had just rewritten the political geography of an entire kingdom. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The moment stretched like glass about to shatter. Then Celine laughed. The sound was brittle and sharp, cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. She stepped forward from her position beside the throne, her beautiful face twisted into something ugly. How convenient, she said loudly. The Queen stages a dramatic rescue, and suddenly the territories pledge loyalty. Tell me, did you plan this coronation before or after you committed treason? Eveline turned to look at her, and the expression in her eyes made Celine's smile falter. I planned nothing except survival. The territories made their own choice based on who actually kept them alive. She gestured to the riders still kneeling in the courtyard. These men rode for days to deliver messages because their people insisted. Not because I asked, not because I manipulated, because when their king abandoned them, I didn't. That's a lie, Celine hissed. You've been plotting from the beginning. Have I? Eveline's voice cut through the courtyard like winter wind. Then let's examine the evidence. I built alliances with people the king ignored. I solved problems the king wouldn't address. I saved lives the king was willing to sacrifice. If that's plotting, then competence itself is treason. She turned to face the assembled court. Every person here knows the truth. The kingdom has been running on 2 parallel systems for months. The king's court of parties and proclamations, and the actual governance that kept you fed and defended. You all chose which one mattered more when you kept bringing your real problems to me instead of him. The nobles shifted uncomfortably. Several looked away. Cedric found his voice finally, and it shook with something between rage and despair. You turned my kingdom against me. No. Eveline's tone gentled slightly, and that was somehow more devastating than anger. You did that yourself. I just offered an alternative when yours failed. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Lord Chancellor Brennan stepped forward. His movement broke the frozen tableau, and suddenly everyone was looking at him instead of the confrontation between king and queen. "Your Majesty," he said, addressing Cedric formally. "If I may speak." Cedric nodded numbly. Brennan took a breath that seemed to carry the weight of decades. "I have served the crown for 42 years. I served your father and your grandfather before him. I have watched kingdoms rise and fall based on single decisions made in moments like this." He looked around at the assembled nobles. "What we face now is not a question of treason or loyalty. It's a question of survival. The Northern Territories have made their position clear. If we arrest the Queen, we fracture the kingdom. If we execute her, we guarantee civil war. But if we do nothing," Celine interjected, "we admit the king has no authority. If we do nothing, we admit the king values stability over pride." Brennan's voice hardened. "Which is what leadership actually requires." He turned back to Cedric. "Your Majesty, you have 3 choices. Arrest your wife and watch the kingdom tear itself apart. Acknowledge her contributions and find a way to govern together. Or step aside and let someone else bear the burden you've proven unwilling to carry." The courtyard erupted into shocked murmurs, suggesting abdication was itself close to treason. But Cedric just stood there, staring at Eveline like he was seeing her for the first time. Really seeing her. Not the abandoned bride or the political threat or the competent administrator who made him look weak. Just a woman who'd been trying to save his kingdom while he'd been too distracted to notice it needed saving. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Did you ever actually want to be queen?" Eveline blinked at the unexpected question. The honest answer settled in her chest like a stone. "No," she said quietly. "I wanted to be your partner. I wanted to build something together. I wanted a marriage that meant more than politics." She met his eyes. "But you didn't want any of that. You wanted Celine and the life you had before I arrived. So I became what the kingdom needed instead of what I wanted to be." "And what did you want to be?" "Just someone who mattered to you." Eveline's voice cracked slightly. "Someone you chose because you wanted me, not because diplomacy required it." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and painful. Cedric looked at her, and she saw something break behind his eyes. Some last defense crumbling under the weight of everything they'd destroyed. "I was a coward," he said finally. "On our wedding night and every day since. I took the easy path, pleasure over duty, comfort over challenge. And you paid the price for my weakness." "Yes," Eveline agreed. "I did." The simplicity of the acknowledgement seemed to hit Cedric harder than any accusation. He turned to look at Celine, who stood rigid with fury, her beautiful face a mask of calculation falling apart. "You need to leave," he told her. "What?" "You need to leave the palace. Today. Now." Cedric's voice grew stronger. "Pack your things and go. I'll provide an estate and income, but you cannot stay here." Celine's composure shattered completely. "You're choosing her. After everything I've done for you, you're choosing the foreign bitch who tried to steal your throne. She didn't try to steal anything." Cedric's voice was tired. "She just picked up the pieces I dropped. And you convinced me to punish her for it because my competence threatened your position. That's not..." "It's exactly true." Cedric looked at her without anger, just exhaustion. "I loved you. Or I thought I did. But what we had wasn't love, it was comfort. And it cost me everything that actually mattered." He gestured to the courtyard, to the kingdom beyond. "Get out, before I have you removed." Celine stared at him with naked hatred. Then she turned that gaze on Eveline. "This isn't over," she said. "Yes, it is." Eveline's voice was flat and final. "You lost the moment you mistook cruelty for strategy. Now leave before someone decides the kingdom would be better off with you in a cell for forging treason charges." Celine went white. For a moment she looked like she might say something else. Then she turned and fled, her silk gown trailing behind her like a flag of surrender. The courtyard exhaled collectively. Cedric turned back to Eveline, and she saw in his face something she'd never seen before: genuine humility. "I don't deserve forgiveness," he said, "and I'm not asking for it. But I'm asking for a chance to fix what I broke. How? By giving you what you've earned." Cedric's voice grew formal, projecting to the entire court. "I propose a formal power-sharing arrangement. Queen Eveline will be granted full authority over governance, military strategy, and economic policy. All major decisions will require both our seals. She will rule in practice while I learn to actually be the king this realm deserves. Murmurs rippled through the assembled nobles. This was unprecedented, radical, a complete restructuring of royal authority, and absolutely necessary. Eveline studied Cedric's face, looking for deception or manipulation, but all she saw was a broken man trying to salvage something from the wreckage of his failures. The question was whether she could work with him, whether she could set aside the hurt and humiliation and betrayal and focus on what the kingdom needed. She thought about the northern territories depending on her, the military commanders who'd followed her orders, the merchants and farmers and common people who'd sent letters thanking her for caring. They needed stability more than she needed revenge. "I accept," she said finally, "on one condition. Name it. You attend every council meeting, every military briefing, every budget review. If we're going to do this, you're going to learn what governing actually requires. No more delegating the hard work and taking credit for the results." Cedric nodded. "Agreed. And you publicly acknowledge that the kingdom's recent stability came from my governance, not luck or your leadership." His jaw tightened, but he nodded again. "Agreed. Then we have a deal." Eveline extended her hand. Cedric took it, and the handshake felt like a treaty being signed. Not between lovers or even partners, between two people who'd finally found common ground in their shared responsibility to something larger than themselves. The court erupted into conversation. Some nobles looked pleased, others worried. A few appeared genuinely shocked that the crisis had resolved without bloodshed. General Thorne approached Eveline as the crowd began to disperse. "Your Majesty, that was either brilliant or insane. I'm still deciding which. Can it be both?" Eveline felt exhaustion creeping through her bones now that the immediate crisis had passed. "You could have pushed for abdication. Half the kingdom would have supported it, and the other half would have fought." Eveline shook her head. "I didn't save this realm just to watch it tear itself apart in civil war. This way we get stability and reform without bloodshed. You're more merciful than he deserves." "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just tired of fighting." She looked at Thorne. "Either way, the war is over. Now comes the harder part." "What's that?" "Actually governing. Together. With a man I don't trust and can't forgive, but have to work with anyway." Eveline's smile was bitter. Welcome to politics. Over the following weeks, a new pattern emerged in the palace. Cedric kept his word. He attended meetings. He listened to briefings. He asked questions that showed he was actually trying to understand instead of just appearing engaged. It was awkward and painful and often frustrating, but slowly, incrementally, something that resembled functional governance began to take shape. Eveline ran the day-to-day operations while Cedric focused on learning what he should have known all along. They worked in parallel, occasionally intersecting, maintaining a professional distance that never quite crossed into genuine partnership. The kingdom stabilized. Trade routes reopened. Military readiness improved. The corruption that had flourished under Cedric's negligence was systematically rooted out and destroyed. And through it all, Eveline felt herself changing. The woman who'd been abandoned on her wedding night had forged herself into something harder and colder out of necessity. But now, with the immediate crises resolved, she found herself wondering who she actually was beneath the armor she'd built. The answer came one evening, 3 months after the courtyard confrontation. Eveline was working late in her solar, reviewing agricultural reports, when Cedric knocked on her door. Actually knocked, instead of barging in like he used to. "Come in," she said. He entered carrying 2 glasses of wine and looking uncertain. "Do you have a moment?" "For what?" "Conversation." Cedric set the glasses down. Not about governance or policy, just talking. Eveline studied him suspiciously. "Why?" "Because we've been working together for months, and I've realized I don't actually know you. The real you, beneath the strategist and administrator. You could have learned that before we married." "I know." Cedric sat down across from her. "I was a fool. I chose easy over worthwhile, familiar over excellent. And by the time I realized what I'd thrown away, you'd already become someone I didn't recognize." Eveline felt something twist in her chest. "I became who I needed to be to survive." "I know, and I hate that I forced you into that." Cedric's voice was quiet. You should have been able to be yourself. Instead, you had to become this. He gestured to the stacks of documents, the maps, the evidence of a woman who'd built an empire out of abandonment. This is who I am now, Eveline said. You can't unmake what necessity forged. I don't want to unmake it. I just want to understand it. Cedric met her eyes. Tell me about yourself. The woman you were before I broke her. Eveline felt tears prick her eyes unexpectedly. That woman is gone. Is she? Or is she just buried under armor that doesn't need to be quite so heavy anymore? The question hung between them. Eveline looked at the man she'd married, the man who'd hurt her so deeply she'd thought the wound could never heal, and saw, for the first time, genuine regret and a desire to actually know her. It wasn't love. It might never be love. But it was something. I wanted to be a scholar, she said finally. Before I was a princess, before I was political currency. I wanted to study languages and history, write books that mattered, discover things nobody had thought to look for. Cedric smiled slightly. That explains the 4 languages. 5, actually. I learned the Eastern dialects during my confinement. Eveline felt herself relaxing incrementally. Had to do something to keep my mind sharp. What else? I hate roses. They remind me of our wedding night. She watched his face fall. I prefer winter jasmine. It blooms when everything else is dead. Feels appropriate somehow. Cedric absorbed that. Noted. No more roses. They talked through the evening, not about policy or power, but about small things, preferences, memories. The pieces of themselves they'd never bothered to share because their marriage had been political from the start. It didn't heal the wounds, but it was something like the beginning of scar tissue, the first fragile growth over damage that would never completely disappear. As Cedric left later that night, he paused at the door. I know I can never make up for what I did, he said, but I want you to know, I'm grateful. For your strength. For your refusal to let me destroy the kingdom through negligence, for being better than I deserved. Don't make me into a saint, Eveline said tiredly. I'm not. I just refuse to be a victim. That's what makes you remarkable. Cedric's smile was sad. You took the worst night of your life and turned it into the foundation of an empire. After he left, Eveline sat alone in her solar and thought about that. About the woman she'd become out of necessity, about the armor she'd built, and whether she'd ever be able to take it off completely. The truth was complicated and uncomfortable. She was grateful for what the betrayal had forced her to become, even as she mourned the softer woman who'd been destroyed in the process. She'd gained power and respect and the grudging admiration of an entire kingdom. She'd proven that intelligence and determination could reshape reality. But she'd lost the ability to trust easily, to hope without calculating the odds, to believe in happy endings instead of strategic compromises. The trade-off felt simultaneously worthwhile and devastating. 6 months after the power-sharing arrangement began, the kingdom held its first joint address from both monarchs. Eveline stood beside Cedric on the palace balcony, looking out at thousands of citizens gathered in the square below. The crowd was larger than any she'd seen, drawn by curiosity about the unprecedented arrangement. Cedric spoke first, his voice carrying across the square. For too long, this kingdom suffered under my negligence. I ignored problems, delegated responsibility, and prioritized personal comfort over public duty. The consequences nearly destroyed us all. He paused, letting that sink in. Queen Eveline saved this realm when I would not. She governed when I refused. She fought when I was too weak. Everything we have accomplished in recent months, the stability, the prosperity, the security, flows from her competence and courage. He turned to look at Eveline. Today, I formally acknowledge what everyone already knows. The Queen is not just my partner in governance. She is the foundation upon which this kingdom stands. The crowd erupted into cheers. Eveline stepped forward, and the noise gradually subsided. I didn't ask for the role I've come to fill, she said clearly. I didn't plan to become what necessity demanded. But when faced with a choice between accepting dysfunction and building something better, I chose to build. She looked out at the sea of faces. Every person here has that same choice every day. Accept the world as it is or work to make it what it should be. I chose the latter, and I invite all of you to do the same. She gestured to Cedric. The king and I will never have a perfect partnership. We've hurt each other too deeply for that. But we found something more valuable than perfection. shared purpose, a commitment to this kingdom that transcends our personal failures. Her voice grew stronger. That's what I want you to remember. Not the scandal or the drama or the political intrigue. Remember that change is possible, that competence matters, that you don't need to accept betrayal or abandonment or dysfunction as inevitable. She paused, feeling the weight of thousands of eyes on her. You can survive being broken. You can rebuild yourself into something stronger than you were, and you can use that strength to reshape the world around you. The crowd's response was deafening. As Eveline and Cedric retreated from the balcony, she felt something shift inside her chest. Not healing, the wounds were too deep for that, but acceptance. She would never be the woman she'd planned to become. That version of herself had died the night Cedric abandoned her. But the woman she'd forged in that death's aftermath was something extraordinary, harder than she'd wanted to be, colder than she'd ever imagined becoming, but powerful in ways that soft, trusting girl could never have achieved. The trade-off would haunt her forever. But she could live with it. Because at the end of everything, after the betrayal and the battles and the brutal choices that had defined her transformation, she'd accomplished something that mattered. She'd saved a kingdom, not through love or loyalty or any of the virtues the story celebrated, through intelligence sharp enough to cut through corruption, through strength forged in abandonment, through the ruthless calculus of a woman who'd learned that survival sometimes required becoming someone you never wanted to be. That night, alone in her chambers, Eveline allowed herself to remember the girl who'd waited in a candlelit room for a husband who never came. She mourned that girl, the softness, the hope, the belief that goodness would be rewarded and vows actually meant something. Then she set the mourning aside and returned to the work that never ended. The reports that needed reviewing, the decisions that required making, the endless responsibility of keeping a kingdom alive. This was her life now. Not the fairy tale she'd imagined, not the partnership she'd hoped for, but something she'd built with her own hands from the wreckage of broken promises. And as she worked through the night, she realized something that felt almost like peace. She didn't need Cedric's love anymore. She didn't need validation or approval or any of the things she'd once thought would make her complete. She had something better, something that couldn't be given or taken away by anyone else. She had herself. The person she'd forged in fire, imperfect and scarred and harder than she'd ever wanted to become, but unbreakable. 3 years later, Cedric stood before the assembled court and made an announcement that surprised no one who'd been paying attention. After long consideration and consultation with the royal council, I have decided to formally abdicate the throne. Not because I'm forced to, but because the kingdom deserves better than a king who had to learn to care. He looked at Eveline, who stood beside the throne with the composed expression she'd perfected over years of governance. Queen Eveline has proven herself the superior ruler in every measurable way. She has earned the crown through competence, courage, and a commitment to this realm that I could never match. He picked up the physical crown from its cushion and turned to face her fully. "Your Majesty," he said formally, "this was always yours. I was just keeping it warm." Cedric placed the crown on Eveline's head himself. The symbolism was perfect and devastating. A king acknowledging that bloodline and tradition meant nothing compared to actual ability. A man admitting that the woman he'd humiliated had become the better monarch. Eveline felt the weight of the crown settle onto her head and thought about the journey that had brought her here. The abandoned bride becoming the Iron Queen, the foreign princess reshaping an entire kingdom. She thought about the cost, the woman she'd had to kill inside herself to survive, the softness she'd armored over, the trust she'd lost that would never fully return. And she thought about what she'd gained, not just power, but purpose, not just respect, but the knowledge that she'd earned every bit of it through merit rather than birth. The crowd in the throne room erupted into cheers. Eveline stood and faced them as their queen, not consort, not partner, queen. She raised her hand for silence, and the room obeyed instantly. "I accept this crown," she said clearly, "not because I wanted it, but because I earned it, not through marriage or manipulation, but through the simple act of caring about this kingdom more than my own comfort." She looked around at the assembled nobles, seeing the mix of admiration and calculation in their faces. "To those who supported me from the beginning, thank you. Your loyalty will be remembered and rewarded." She let her gaze fall on the nobles who'd backed Cedric's worst impulses. To those who enabled corruption and dysfunction, your time is over. The new order values competence over connections. You'll adapt or you'll be replaced. Several nobles shifted uncomfortably. And to everyone watching this transition and wondering what kind of ruler I'll be, Evelyn continued, let me be clear. I will be exactly who I've always been. Practical, strategic, ruthless when necessary, merciful when possible, and absolutely committed to this kingdom's prosperity. She touched the crown on her head. This isn't a fairy tale. I didn't win through love or magic or destiny. I won through intelligence, determination, and the willingness to become what the moment required. Her voice grew softer, but somehow more powerful. And I want every person in this kingdom, especially every woman who's been told she's not enough, not strong enough, not smart enough, to understand this. You don't need permission to be extraordinary. You don't need validation to reshape the world. You just need courage and competence and the refusal to accept that the way things are is the way they have to be. The throne room erupted again, louder this time. As the celebration began, Evelyn retreated to a quiet balcony overlooking the kingdom she now ruled alone. Cedric found her there, holding 2 glasses of wine like he had that first evening they'd actually talked. Congratulations, he said, offering her a glass. You finally got what you deserved. Evelyn accepted the wine but didn't drink. Did I? I wanted a partnership. I got a crown instead. I'm not sure that's a fair trade. It's what you made of a bad situation. Cedric leaned against the railing beside her. And you made something incredible. At what cost? I can't answer that for you. Only you know what you lost. Evelyn sipped the wine and looked out over the city lights spreading below them like stars brought to earth. I lost the ability to trust easily, to hope without calculation, to believe that goodness matters more than strategy. She turned to look at him. I became the woman this kingdom needed. But sometimes I miss the woman I could have been if you just loved me the way you promised. Cedric's face crumpled. I'm sorry. For all of it. For every choice that made you have to choose between softness and survival. Sorry doesn't undo damage. Evelyn's voice was gentle but firm. But it's something. And maybe that's all we get. Not healing, but acknowledgement. Not forgiveness, but understanding. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. If you could go back to our wedding night, knowing everything that would happen, would you still marry me? Evelyn considered the question seriously. The betrayal, the pain, the brutal transformation from abandoned bride to Iron Queen. Yes, she said finally, because everything I've become, everything I've accomplished, it all grew from that moment. You broke me that night, and I rebuilt myself into something unbreakable. She smiled, and it was complicated and sad and somehow triumphant all at once. So thank you, I suppose, for being exactly weak enough to force me to become strong. Cedric absorbed that. What will you do now? Rule. Evelyn's voice was steady as stone. Govern this kingdom with everything I learned from watching yours fail. Build something that lasts beyond scandal and drama. And personally, I'll keep being the woman necessity forged. She touched the crown, alone, powerful. And finally, completely free to be exactly who I am without apology or compromise. That sounds lonely. It is. Evelyn looked him in the eyes. But it's mine, my choice, my consequence, my kingdom. She raised her glass. To survival, to transformation, to the women who refuse to break when the world tries to shatter them. Cedric raised his glass as well. To the Iron Queen. Long may she reign. They drank in silence as the kingdom celebrated below. 2 people who'd destroyed each other, finding something almost like peace in the ruins. Years later, historians would debate whether Evelyn's reign marked a golden age or simply a return to competent governance after a period of dysfunction. They would argue about whether her methods were too ruthless, whether she'd been too unforgiving, whether a different approach might have achieved the same results with less personal cost. But the people who lived through it never debated. They remembered a queen who'd saved them when their king wouldn't, who'd governed with intelligence and strategy, who'd proven that competence mattered more than bloodline. And most importantly, they remembered a woman who'd been abandoned and humiliated and left to fail, and had instead rebuilt herself into something powerful enough to reshape an empire. The Iron Queen, the woman who turned betrayal into a throne, standing alone at the center of power, untouchable and unbreakable and absolutely free. The greatest mistake the king ever made was leaving his queen alone long enough to become unstoppable. And the greatest gift that betrayal gave Evelyn was the knowledge that she never needed anyone else's approval to be extraordinary. She was enough, all by herself, without apology or compromise. And that truth, hard-won and paid for in tears and transformation, was worth more than any crown. The end.